Chapter 924. Logically speaking, the two of them were the trusted aides of the Silver Queen. Even the slightest mishap wouldn't be enough to make them so nervous. However, 2 days ago, or to be more precise, 2 nights ago, the Empire suddenly lost contact with Fort Persilion. Anyone with half a brain would know what that meant. Bad premonitions were often the most accurate. In the next 24 hours, bad news floated in like snowflakes. First, the Pegasus Knight of Asgard's garrison detected the movements of a large legion in the Bear Lake area. Then, another scout cavalry detected another legion in the Silver Spring Valley further south. 27 hours later, Vargos, Hemlock Town, and Forest Avenue were confirmed to have fallen. 29 hours later, Nephil and Taris of Gemini Town in the north of the Bear Lake area reported that traces of an unfamiliar army were found in the outskirts of Greystone Town in the lower reaches of the Silver Spring Valley. 34 hours later, the southern town of Gemini Town was lost. 2 hours later, the northern town was lost. 37 hours later, an Imperial military outpost at the edge of the Long Boot Forest received some remnants from the south. Among them, Baron Pyrrhus of the Cooper family was found. 44 hours later, Greystone Town was surrounded. Half an hour later, the cavalry of Emerald Claw Fort finally brought back accurate news that Fort Persilion had fallen. A large army of Jorgendi Ridge was attacking along the eastern branch of Broken Sword Mountains in the direction of Fort Elno. The Empire's Fort Legion was losing ground. 15 minutes ago, Rusif was confirmed to have fallen. The Pegasus Knight flew over the city and observed that the city was bombarded by spells that exceeded the 12th circle. None of the residents in the city survived. Jorgendi Ridge had launched an invasion of the Empire. Most of Enzlova had fallen, the Evergreen Corridor was in danger, and Rokiki, the Broken Sword Mountains, had become a star in the distant sky. It was as if in an instant, terrible news spread from the White Rose Garden to the entire imperial capital like a plague. The news followed the knight out of St. Cantilever Palace and into the mansions of the dukes, counts, imperial guards, knight orders, and important figures of the Holy Cathedral. It was as if a spark had been splashed into a pool of oil, setting the manors ablaze. Under the arched windows, in the attics, and in the private rooms of the nobles, candles were lit. Then, people in plain clothes with their faces covered walked out from the back door, passed through the streets, and entered the houses of the nobles. Then came the servants. They hurriedly left their masters' mansions, drove carriages, or walked to thousands of unknown corners of the city. The news was whispered by word of mouth, passed from one person to the next, and the next person boarded a carriage and went along the streets to the 22 city gates of Rushta. Before dawn, countless carriages left the city and went in every direction of the Empire. Some of them went to the countryside, some to the castles, and some to the docks. The news of the war rode the wind and broke the waves, spreading across the Empire's territory. This was what happened in the 48 hours before Mr. Travis Burney and the captain of the Dragoons, Mr. Kevin de Sanvaria, entered the White Rose. At this moment, in front of Constance, the captain of the Dragoons appeared to be a little more rational, but Mr. Travis was almost trembling. The former was in charge of the evaluation of the internal knight's promotion, while he was mainly in charge of intelligence gathering and monitoring. Obviously, he was the one responsible for the current situation. The captain of the knight was trembling. He wanted to explain himself to the Empire's most powerful person, but Constance didn't need an explanation. She wanted an answer. The two of them weren't the only ones in the Queen's study. All the important figures of the Empire had already gathered together. Standing at the front was the captain of the White Legion, Marquis Nigel, Count Bendron, Donnas, Little Netherwin, the head of the Cecil family, the current captain of the Azure Legion, Count Rodney, and Grand Duke Helix. Behind them were some nobles from other families, most of whom were close to Her Majesty. In addition, there were the envoys from the Holy Cathedral of Fire. These people were roughly divided into 3 camps. The nobles close to the Palutes were obviously gloomy, while the nobles from the Cecil family and the military were mostly smiling at this scene. The last group of people, led by Grand Duke Helix and Chancellor Little Netherwin, had a straight face and no expression could be seen on their faces. As for Her Majesty herself, her expression was normal. There wasn't a trace of anger in her eyes, and of course, there wasn't a trace of leniency. But anyone who knew the Empire's most powerful person would understand that she was often the most terrifying when she was in this state. After a while, Constance finally spoke. She glanced at the two of them. Although Her Majesty still had the appearance of a young girl, her calm eyes showed that she was a shrewd woman. She spoke coldly, "This is the second time. My dear House of Pallet, and the nobles of the South, your recent performance is not worthy of your status. Mr. Commander, whether it is you or your brother, you have disappointed me. Why are you not saying a word? Are you waiting for me to speak?" Hearing this, the nobles of the Cecil family rejoiced in the misfortune of the Cecil family, while the soldiers looked as if they were waiting for a good show. Only Nidwin frowned. In his memory, the Queen rarely expressed her attitudes so clearly, but this was already the third time in recent times. Whether it was the reprimand of the Cecil family in St. Cantifer Palace, the reprimand of Duke Pallet in the White Rose Garden, or her current attitude, it all made him feel strange. However, to Nidwin, this was merely an oddity. On the other hand, Donna's expression had long changed. How terrifying was the thunderous fury from the throne! He could not help but tremble in fear. He clenched his teeth, not daring to speak at all. On the other hand, Travis nearly swayed. Although His Majesty had said the word "dear," Travis' face nearly turned green. After hesitating for a while, he could only reply respectfully, "I dare not, Your Majesty." "Then tell me, west of Emerald Claw Fort, what about the movements of the Lion Men in Toquinin?" "Nothing, Your Majesty." Travis quickly wiped his sweat and answered. "What about the elves in the wild of the Four Realms?" This time, it was Nigel, the commander of the White Legion, who answered. The latter shook his head and said, "Nothing, but the elves should not have received the news yet. Otherwise, they would not have given up on this opportunity. So at least Georgandy Ridge has nothing to do with the Wind Elves?" Constance asked. When she asked this question, she frowned slightly as if she was thinking about something. But there was a faint feeling that the Queen's mind was not on everything that was happening at the moment. Like Prime Minister Nidwin, Nigel seemed to have noticed this as well. But this doubt only flashed in his mind for a moment before he shook his head and said, "Probably not." "What about the Lion Men in Toquinin?" "The Lion Men should be waiting for news. As soon as the army of Georgandy Ridge arrives at Elner Castle, they will make their move." Little Nidwin looked at the Queen and finally spoke. "How big is the army of Georgandy Ridge?" Constance and the young Prime Minister looked at each other, then looked away and put pressure on Travis. The latter was sweating profusely and said, "Your Majesty, this is not clear, but they should have at least 2 legions in Enslova." The Silver Queen was silent, as if she was calculating something. Little Nidwin pondered for a moment and said, "It is very likely that the underground kings have already made their move. Otherwise, at least half of the lords of Georgandy Ridge would have to be mobilized to achieve this scale. Their target is Asgard." Constance snapped out of her daze and said, "Then, do we have any countermeasures now? Are there still troops in Enslova? We could have mobilized Anzaruda's army, but now..." Little Nidwin stopped mid-sentence and looked at Donna's in the crowd. The latter's face darkened and he cursed the Prime Minister in his heart. He understood what the Prime Minister meant. Apart from the natives of Anzaruda, the local legions stationed there were mainly in the hands of Count Jean and Count Alcons. However, this part of the army had already been mobilized to replenish Fort Persilian. As for the rest of the noble army, everyone knew where it was. He quickly stepped forward and said, "Your Majesty, Anzaruda's army has already been replenished to Rokizi, the Broken Sword mountain range. The remaining militia and local defense forces are useless. Even if there were any, they would have been defeated by the unruly Count Tonagel. Being fooled by an heroine is a glorious thing in Mr. Donna's eyes, Duke Cecil said sarcastically. The latter's face turned pale and red, but he did not dare to retort. The Prime Minister of the Empire was clearly unhappy with him. Constance's face returned to its cold expression. Where is the nearest army? 2 divisions of the White Legion's Pegasus Cavalry are stationed in Violet Valley, Your Majesty, Marquis Nigel replied immediately. Can we make it in time? Donna shook his head. If we want to reinforce Azaph, we have to go through the Evergreen Corridor. Unless Greystone Town can hold on for at least 48 hours, we won't be able to make it in time. Constance looked at her courtiers with a mocking gaze. In other words, we have to give up Anzaruda. Or if Rokizi, the Broken Sword Mountain Range, is lost, this is the greatest humiliation in the history of the Empire. You want me to bear it? There was silence in the room. The Silver Queen looked at her courtiers and laughed coldly. Donnas, go inform Duke Paluda that my bottom line is to protect Rokiki and the Broken Sword Mountain Range strongholds from being lost. If you can't even do that, it means that you don't have the right to manage this land. When that happens, let the White Legion take over the defense from Anzaruda to the Evergreen Corridor. Constance's voice was not loud, but it was like a thunderclap in the crowd. Everyone's eyes fell on the Queen's favorite courtier in an instant. Their gazes were filled with surprise, doubt, curiosity, sympathy, fear, and schadenfreude. Almost everyone present was an old fox who had been in the center of the Empire's power for a long time. They naturally understood the weight of this sentence. Her Majesty was really angry this time. Donna's body swayed and he almost fainted. He looked at the Prime Minister of the Empire with a pale face, but he did not dare to complain. He quickly bowed and said, I understand. Only then did he dejectedly part the crowd and walk out of the study. Only the trembling Travice was left in the study, but Constance did not even bother to look at him. With a flick of her sleeve, she left the room with her maid. When Laudney and the other nobles left the White Rose Garden, he purposely stayed a step behind to catch up with Duke Helix. The latter was about to board his carriage when he noticed the actions of the new head of House Ashric. He turned around and asked, Count, is there anything I can help you with? Laudney smiled bitterly. My apologies, Duke Helix. I'm here to ask what you think of Her Majesty's words. Hearing this, the Duke stopped in his tracks and retracted his foot. He looked at Laudney with a serious expression. What do you think, Count Helix? Her Majesty seems to have relaxed her surveillance on the military recently, but she's been suppressing us more and more in secret. I thought she would take the opportunity to support House Parrot, but I didn't expect. Duke Helix shook his head. Her Majesty's personality has become more and more withdrawn. House Parrot has been out of her favor for some time now. Laudney seemed to have thought of something. Ever since that incident, Duke Helix shot him a wary glance. Shut up. This isn't something we should be discussing. Little Rodney, since your father and I are old friends, I'll give you a word of advice. While there's still a chance, go back to your dominion. Laudney was stunned. Duke Helix, you. The Duke nodded. In less than a week, I will leave the royal capital and return to Flowerleaf Domain. Laudney looked at him in shock. Leaving the royal capital at this time was the same as leaving the center of the Empire's power. It was something unimaginable for nobles of their level. Duke Helix shook his head. Little Laudney, you were still young back then, but I saw it with my own eyes. I don't want to experience it again. All right, that's all I have to say. I'm only telling you this because of the relationship between our families. If you believe me, then believe me. If you don't, then don't spread it to anyone else. As for how to weigh the pros and cons, I'll leave it to you to figure it out yourself. After saying that, he waved at the ladder and boarded the carriage, leaving Rodney standing in the same place as he thoughtfully watched the carriage slide into the darkness. But in the end, Duke Helix smiled and shook his head. Bettina quietly slipped into the room and closed the door behind her. She then turned around and looked left and right in the dark room as if she was looking for something. At that moment, a voice called out. "Bettina, you're back." The round-faced maid was startled. She then recognized the voice as the Count's and sighed in relief. Although she couldn't find where Scarlet was in the room, she quickly nodded. After a while, there seemed to be a moment of silence before the voice asked again, "How is it? Are the rumors outside true?" "It's all true, Count Helix. It said that the Empire lost the war in the south. Now, Ansloy and Rokovich are in danger." She pondered for a moment as if she was trying to recall something. "But it's strange. This time, it's not the Lion Men or the Wind Elves of St. Ossol. It's the army of Georgandy Ridge. I've never even heard of that place." Georgandy Ridge. Scarlet was slightly startled. She suddenly remembered the cave dwellers led by Abes. She was in a daze for a moment. Her longing for Erwin grew stronger. With a creak, she opened the window. Only then did Betisha discover that her lord was actually standing by the window. The other party was hugging the emerald spear and staring out of the window in a daze. His eyes reflected the starlight under the distant night sky. She could not help but frown. Not good, the Count's illness is acting up again. After a while, Scarlet turned around. She seemed to have remembered something and called out. "Bettina, Bettina." "I'm here, Count Helix." Bettina hurriedly replied. "How far is Ansloy from the Rusif you mentioned last time?" she asked softly. Bettina opened her mouth, but her heart skipped a beat. She couldn't say anything else. Scarlet's bright eyes stared at him. "Is Count Helix there?" Of course, Bettina knew who this his lordship was, but she couldn't help but grumble inwardly. She thought to herself, why did I help this Count to gather information? So this is his true purpose. But as a maid, she didn't dare to lie, so she could only nod her head honestly. Before she could nod her head a second time, she felt her Count rush to her and grab her shoulder. He asked hurriedly, "Where is he? Where is the army of Georgandy Ridge now? Is he in danger?" Bettina was so scared that she almost screamed. She hurriedly shook her head with a pale face. How could a maid like her know about these things? Rumors about these things had spread like wildfire outside, but none of them were reliable. At most, she could only get a rough understanding of it. However, she knew that if she said that, Count Helix would probably not be able to sleep well for the next few days. She could only comfort him. Count Helix, that Tonajol lord might have left Ansloy long ago. If he takes a ship from Lone, it won't take long for him to reach Bankel. He might already be on the Sublime Sea by now. Scarlet seemed to have heard her words. She relaxed and looked at her maid. She nodded and said, "Thank you, Betisha. Count Helix, this is what I should do." As Bettina spoke, she prayed in her heart. She hoped that Martha would bless Count Helix so that he could recover quickly and stop being so mysterious. P.S. Thank you to a certain PPT netizen for creating a relationship chart for Amber. I've received it, and it's been of great help to me. Looking at these things, I can really feel everyone's deep love for Amber. I'm really touched. When I received this relationship chart, I felt full of motivation. I can continue writing Amber until the perfect ending. Thank you, everyone. Chapter 9:25. Brando pushed aside the trees, and the branches and leaves of the shrubs rustled as if a window had been opened in the dense, overlapping branches, revealing the scenery behind. Looking down, there were layers upon layers of terraces, and between the mountains, there was a bright mirror. This was the Brown Bear Lake. Everyone let out a long sigh of satisfaction in unison. In order to avoid encountering Georgandy Ridge, they had to trudge through the mountains and forests. It was not an easy task, especially after they abandoned their carriages. For these pampered young ladies and nobles, it was simply fatal. Brando, I think there's something over there. The Roman was the only one who did not seem to be tired. She held the hand of the Duke of Gringoire's daughter. The latter's wet nurse had to be supported by others to move forward. She peeked her head out and looked around. Soon, she shouted. Brando knew that her senses were extraordinary, so he quickly stopped and asked, "Can you see what it is?" "It looks like people." "1, 2. Are they alive or dead?" Chiara asked. These days, they had seen the merchant girl's ability more than once. At first, some were doubtful, but gradually, they became envious and amazed. Because of the Roman, the envoy's guards did not even have to risk releasing gargoyles into the sky to investigate. Although the gargoyles had a wide field of vision, they were more likely to be exposed in the sky. Georgandy Ridge also had harpies and drakes as their air force. I don't know. The two of them were sitting back to back under a beech tree. Did they move? I don't think so. Then they're probably dead. Where are they? By the lake. There's a white rock over there, right under the third tree, the Roman replied. Everyone gasped. It was at least 10 miles from here to the Brown Bear Lake, and they could only see layers upon layers of tree canopies as far as the eye could see. However, the merchant girl could see the two people under the tree by the lake. What kind of eyesight was that? The Duke of Gringoire's daughter looked at the Roman holding her hand with admiration and said crisply, "Sister Roman, you're amazing." The Roman was overjoyed, but she pretended to be serious and replied, "Of course, I'm amazing." Brando looked at her. Although her face was tense, her curved eyes revealed her thoughts. He shook his head and said, "Let's go and take a look." It was impossible to continue avoiding Georgandy Ridge when they arrived at the Bear Lake area. There was a town called Greystone, which was the only exit to the west of the silver gushing valley. Brando, and he believed that the people of the Underdark. So instead of passively fighting, it was better to prepare first. The group walked down the mountain and walked to the place Roman said. Sure enough, they saw two people sitting back to back under a tree. They were two Kurlutzian soldiers who had been dead for a long time. The group parted the bushes and approached the corpses. The Roman hurriedly covered the eyes of the Duke's daughter with her hand. The others could see the gray robes on the two corpses and the star-shaped rose emblem on the robes. Brando recognized the emblem as Sauvin's emblem, which was the emblem of the Land Dragon Knight of Caronia. This proved that the two corpses were soldiers of Anslova's army. The Land Dragon Knight of Caronia. This is Sir Fister's army. Some Cruz nobles recognized the corpses and whispered, "Has the North Mountain Outpost been lost?" "Where's the North Mountain Outpost?" Brando asked. "It's north of here, on the only way to Buos." Rogers looked at the two corpses and replied. Brando nodded and squatted down beside the corpses. He carefully examined the wounds. The first corpse had a penetrating wound, but it was not fatal. He had died from excessive blood loss. He compared the wound to the armor under the robes and came to a conclusion. The Land Dragon Knight of Caronia was a Grade 3 unit. The one who killed him should be another Grade 3 unit from Georgandy Ridge, the Razor Boar. The Razor Boar was a tamed beast of the subterranean dwellers. Since the Razor Boar was here, there should be subterranean dwellers around. The Razor Boar's special ability was Charge and Death Strike. The ability of Charge was similar to a warrior's charge. Death Strike allowed it to generate a false life force equivalent to 10% of its total health after receiving enough damage to kill it. It would only die after the false life force was depleted or it lasted for more than 10 minutes. Brando thought of the Razor Boar's ability and suddenly cursed. Why was it so similar to his own ability? However, He was even more puzzled about the razor boar's ability being countered by the land dragon knight's low roar. The low roar of the land dragon knight could induce fear in most beasts except for monsters. This was the weapon used by the land dragon knights against other cavalry. It was also effective against the razor boar. Logically speaking, if the land dragon knight wanted to run away, the razor boar would not pose a real threat to them. With such doubts in mind, he checked the second corpse. The injuries on this corpse were very strange. The neck and arms were strangely bent, as if they were broken. Generally speaking, such injuries were caused by blunt force. However, there was no blunt force injury on this corpse. Brando was puzzled. Princess Magadol, accompanied by Dilfari, frowned and looked at the two corpses. She then said, "Count Brando, there is no need to be puzzled. He fell to his death." Fell to his death. Brando suddenly realized. This person must have fallen from the Coronial land dragon's back and broken his spine. He must have died on the spot. His body must have been rescued by his companion, but the latter also died from excessive blood loss. It can't be that simple. How can a well-trained land dragon knight fall from the back of a dragon? They are fixed to the saddle, Chiara replied. She squatted down beside Brando and was about to poke the two corpses with her hands. However, before she could touch them, her hands were pulled away by Brando. "Child, stay away from these things," Brando replied impatiently. "I'm not a child." Brando stopped and looked at the little one. Chiara appeared to be very unhappy. She muttered something to herself, but no one could hear it clearly. Presumably, it wasn't anything good. However, Chiara's words reminded him that the land dragon knight was thrown off the back of the land dragon. The belts on his waist and legs were all broken. Judging from the ends, it was obvious that they were torn and not cut. The Shadrian caveman obviously did not have the ability to do that. Only a land dragon could do that. However, Coronial land dragons were very docile. They rarely went berserk on the battlefield, and they were not easily frightened. They also had a deep affection for their masters. Even if their riders were killed, they would stay beside their dead riders for a long time. Brando really could not figure out why the two Coronial land dragon knights died here alone. There was no sign of their mounts nearby. It was still acceptable if a Coronial land dragon went berserk by accident, but this scene was just too bizarre. He thought for a long time, but he still could not figure it out. At this moment, the Romans suddenly shouted from behind, "Aw! What a big rat!" The Romans shouted again. Everyone turned their heads towards the source of the sound and saw a giant rat escaping from the forest. Its entire body was gray, and it had a long earthworm-like tail. There were 3 strange bone spurs on its back, and its head was larger than a normal house rat's. Its mouth was wide open, and other than the large incisors of rodents, there were 2 rows of sharp teeth. It was hiding under a rock nearby, and it did not expect to be discovered. It jumped in fright and wanted to escape into the bushes. But when Brendel saw it, he picked up the sword beside the corpse and threw it over. A silver light flashed, and the giant rat was nailed to the ground with a thud. The young daughter of the Duke of Grenoires happened to see this. She let out a low cry and hurriedly hid behind Roman. "What is this?" Chiara frowned and looked at the little creature that was struggling on the ground with disgust. "It's a demon rat from the catacombs, the hunting dog of the Shadr cavemen," Maynard answered from behind. "They used this thing to spy on us." Avram was so scared that his fat jiggled. The ball-shaped son of the Duke looked around in horror as if the forest was full of rats staring at them. "Don't tell me we've already been discovered. But this thing is very conspicuous." "As long as it gets close to us, I will notice it," the Roman replied. "Actually, it's not a big deal. Don't worry." Everyone looked at the merchant lady as if they were looking at a freak. However, her words more or less calmed everyone down. Some of them were not willing to follow Brando at first, but the experience in the past 2 days had proven his ability. He knew the underworld creatures better than anyone else. With his experience and judgment, they were able to walk out of Vargas and avoid all the battles that could be avoided. The cruise people followed Brando at first because they were captives, but now, they saw him as their savior. Over the past few days, they had passed by Hemlock Town, Valgas, and several other villages. They had witnessed the scene after the Georgiandy Ridge's army passed by. The villagers who had been turned into statues, the Empire's soldiers, and the subterranean dwellers' heads that were impaled on their spears reminded them of the current situation. Now, no one dared to doubt that they were facing an army from the underworld. Even the most stubborn Count Jean had shut his mouth. The nobles began to panic, and Brendel, who was the only one who remained calm, became their only support. After all, compared to those ferocious monsters, humans were much more amiable. The only thing that made them complain was that Brendel had converted their servants and guards into reserve troops, and confiscated their rations and changed them into uniform rations. The sudden appearance of the demonic rats in the catacombs had diverted everyone's attention. Brando did not dwell on the matter of the land dragons. He told Maynard about his suspicions, and the female knight was equally puzzled. However, she did not have an answer either. After that, the two of them stopped wasting time on it. Obviously, there was no time to bury the corpses, but Brando still asked Rogers and the other three to tidy up the appearance of the two Coronial land dragon knights after they died. Then, they arranged for them to be placed in a secluded place to ensure at least a basic level of decency. The 4 internal knights were very grateful to him. Even the nobles from Cruz had a vague feeling that the Count from Tonajol was not a rude person. The accumulated hatred between them had also been resolved. The team left the lakeside and continued north. Brando's goal was to bypass the Brown Bear Lake before dark and reach the vicinity of Greystone Town. However, when he realized that there might be Shadrons in the vicinity, he asked the team to slow down. The team moved slowly along the forest surrounded by mountains. After that, they discovered a few more corpses of the Empire's local legions. One of them was a small group of walking swordsmen, and the other was another Coronial land dragon knight. However, they did not find his mount either. After that, they began to see signs of a fierce battle and the corpses of the land dwellers. They were a type of cavemen with purple-red skin and long manes. Their bodies were scattered all over the forest filled with fallen leaves. It was obvious that an army of Georgiandy Ridge that was moving north along the Brown Bear Lake had encountered the local legions of Cruz. Both sides engaged in a fierce battle in the forest. There were even traces of magic bombardment in the forest. A streak of flame plowed through the nearby beech trees, leaving a scorched land that was dozens of feet wide and hundreds of feet long. The ashes were filled with pieces of melted metal and other things. Brando estimated that at least half a squadron of Empire soldiers had died here. However, he was a little puzzled. This kind of magic was a bit like the chain of fire thrown by the evil sorcerers. Elementalists and law-defying wizards did not have similar spells. The wild elf sister, Falerne, stood beside the scorched land for a long time, frowning and not saying a word. "It's not elemental magic," she finally answered. They crossed the broken battlefield, but more and more of such scenes appeared. It was hard to imagine what had happened in the forest. Some of the places looked like the land left behind by demons. However, Countess Yenbao was very sensitive to demons. Brando asked her a few times, but all he got was a negative answer. Rogers, Trevor, and Nasha were silent. The nobles behind them were also silent. In their minds, the Empire was difficult to defeat, but the scene in front of them had clearly shattered their fragile expectations. At this time, Brando's position in their hearts had become even more important. But among all of them, only the black-haired young man named Kue was talking to himself. Why did they attack Buos? Are they planning to go around Greystone Town? Brando heard this sentence and looked back at Maynard. Then, both of them shook their heads gently. They arrived at the vicinity of Greystone Town a little later than expected. The sun was slowly setting below the mountains, but there were still a few rays of light in the valley. Brendel and the others stood on a nearby mountain and observed the town downstream of the Silver River. The direction of Greystone Town was dark, like a shadow in the valley. The sunset in the sky had a blood-red glow, as if it was a sign of some kind of disaster before it arrived. No one in the group spoke. Everyone obviously understood what had happened. However, there was even worse news. Brando saw a few harpies hovering in the sky, which meant that there were still underground garrisons in the town. The nobles' faces were a little ugly because this meant that their wishful thinking of easily passing through the exit of the Silver River Valley had failed. Brando had already expected this. He cautiously led the others from the mountain and slowly retreated to the forest behind. He was ready to discuss what to do, whether to wait for the garrisons of Georgandy Ridge to leave or to pass through at night. But at this time, the Roman stretched out her small hand and patted Brando's back. She whispered, "Brando, Brando, look over there. There are a few people." Brando was shocked. He thought to himself, "Miss Roman, if you have something to say, can't you say it earlier?" But his body's reaction was faster than his brain. He almost subconsciously pulled the merchant girl to hide in the bushes. Although the others did not understand what was going on, they followed suit and found a place to hide. The Roman got up from the bushes and spat out a few mouthfuls of grass. She raised her head and wanted to continue looking around, but Brando pressed her small head down. "Where is it?" Brando looked out through the bushes and asked. "There is a row of short trees below. There are a few people hiding under there. Do you see it, Brando? They seem to want to go to the other side." "Ah, someone ran out. It's that sneaky guy." The Roman kept trying to move Brando's hand away from her head, but it was in vain. In the end, she could only answer with some frustration. Brando looked in the direction she pointed and saw a figure flash and disappear under the dense canopy of a goose-eared stalagmite. "That's Walton," Nasha suddenly whispered when she saw the figure. "Who is Walton?" Brando immediately looked at the Knight of Cruz and asked. "He is the captain of Sir Cooper's guard. I have seen him once. He is a swordsman from Ludwig." Nasha looked at him with some distrust and hesitated for a moment before replying. Brando looked back at Rogers, who quickly explained, "Nasha has a special ability. As long as she has seen someone, she will never forget them. If she thinks it is them, then it must be them. Why are they here?" Trevor was a little puzzled. "I thought they had been killed on the north side of the Forest Leaf Avenue like the Moore family." Chapter 9:26. Brando understood that the knight named Trevor was talking about what happened a day ago. After they left Vargas, they headed north along the surging Milky Way. They encountered a battlefield left behind after a fierce battle on the north side of the avenue. The two sides of the battle were obviously the private army of the imperial nobles and the underground creatures of Georgandy Ridge. The battlefield spanning the long river and woodland avenue was covered with corpses of humans, drakes, griffins, cavemen, and harpies. The blood had long solidified in the bone-chilling cold of winter, forming a dark red color on the pebbles. The nobles of Cruz recognized many familiar faces from the pile of corpses. Sir Moore was one of them. A bone arrow pierced through his throat, causing him to fall on his back on the battlefield, becoming one of the many cold corpses. Such a scene usually represented a fiasco of the empire. The nobles of Cruz would not easily leave the bodies of their companions behind for the sake of dignity. Even the corpses of the nobles were ignored. It was almost possible to imagine the scene of Earl Alcorn and his men stepping on the cold river to escape to the north. As for Georgandy Ridge, the underground creatures rarely cleaned up the corpses on the battlefield unless they were short of rations. The impact of the plague on them was even less. Brando, they seemed to be planning to sneak into the town. The Romans suddenly reminded in a low voice. The merchant lady's eyes shone in the twilight, like a cat's eyes in a low-light environment. Brando also noticed this at this time. He immediately said to Rogers, "Mr. Knight, do you have any way to contact them?" Rogers thought for a moment and said, "I know that the local army of Anzaruta has a secret signal. Maybe we can try it." "You can try, but don't let those things above us find us." "I understand." Rogers nodded and crawled into the bushes. He lay there and looked at the dark trees below. Then he put his thumb and index finger into his mouth and whistled. The whistle echoed in the forest under the twilight. It sounded like the scream of an owl, but obviously sharper. The cry of the owl attracted the attention of the harpies above. These monsters drew a huge aid in the air and flew in this direction. The people in the bushes were motionless, quietly waiting for the patrolling eyes in the sky to leave. After a while, the feathered beasts did not find anything unusual and flew back again. Brendel heard the people around him heaving sighs of relief, and he himself was slightly relieved as well. Only the merchant girl beside him did not seem to be afraid at all, as though she did not have a care in the world. The surroundings were silent, gradually leaving only the sound of insects in the darkness. The silhouettes in the goose-eared stalagmites also stopped moving. Roger's forehead was full of nervous cold sweat. He knew several secret codes of the Imperial Army in the Anzaruta region, but he was not sure if they would come in handy at this time. He knew very well what the private armies of these local nobles were like. What he was most worried about was not that these guys could not hear the secret signal, but that they misunderstood the secret signal and did something out of line. If it attracted the attention of the garrison in the city, then it would be a ghost. At this time, he suddenly realized that maybe it was the right choice to not speak just now. The silence lasted for a while, and then the trees below moved again. There was a rustling sound. "Hey!" The Shire looked a little surprised. "There are magicians among them." It was as if a gust of wind had suddenly risen in the forest. The mountain breeze brushed past the canopy and rustled the branches. However, everyone could hear a human whisper amidst the rustling noise. "Who is that?" This was the wind message spell, one of the few communication spells that could be used in areas that were blocked by magic. Because it relied on the power of nature instead of breaking the law of space, this time, spells like the elemental anchor could not work on it. The best elven envoys and druids could even send messages to areas thousands of miles away. However, the wind message spell was slow. It sometimes took a week or even a few months for the wind to travel from one area to another. Moreover, for most elemental envoys, the wind message spell was only a short-distance communication spell that did not exceed the visual range. The sorcerers in the army often used it as a supplement for sign language and lip reading. Brando turned to the Shire and said, "Tell them that we are Earl Jean's men." The Shire looked at his lord in surprise, wondering if Earl Jean, who was now a prisoner, would die of anger after hearing this. Of course, he still did as he was told. Although he was not an elementalist, there were several commonalities among common magic spells. Moreover, one of the characteristics of magic spells was the law of imitation. For an existence of his level, it was not difficult to imitate a magic spell like the wind message. He easily transmitted the message over, and even the words in the wind were more fluent than the other parties. The Shire's method obviously surprised the other party. After a short moment of silence, Brando saw 6 or 7 people standing up one by one under the goose-eared mahogany bushes at the bottom of the hill. They poked their heads out and looked in his direction. He deliberately waved to them to let them know where they were. When the latter saw him, they immediately rushed to the top of the hill. The vegetation on the hill was very dense. Apparently, their short run did not attract any attention from the sky. After a while, they came to a circle of bushes at the top of the hill. The person running at the front was the first to see Erwin's delegation behind him. You! The man obviously recognized Brando. His face changed and he subconsciously wanted to retreat. However, Brando did not give him the chance to do so. He directly raised his hand, and the lines of law in the vast space lit up at the same time, like a net covering the 7 people. Then, he pulled his hand, and the 7 people appeared around them at the same time, and then fell heavily to the ground. The 7 people fell to the ground one by one. When Rogers saw one of them, he whispered in surprise, "Sir Cooper, you're still alive." The man called Sir Cooper looked to be in his early 40s or 50s, but he was short and had a shifty look. His appearance obviously did not match his aristocratic status. However, those who knew him well knew that he was a shrewd guy. When he heard his captain's whisper, he knew something was wrong. He subconsciously turned around and wanted to escape, but unfortunately, he was a step too late. Before he could take a step, he felt his body being pulled up by an invisible force. He was lifted into the air and then fell heavily to the ground. Just as he was scared out of his wits, he faintly heard someone calling his name. Naturally, the monsters of the Georgandy Ridge would not recognize him. The person who spoke Cruz was also a standard local accent of Anzaruda. His mind was working fast, and when he heard the whisper, he immediately calmed down. "Don't shout." He hurriedly whispered to his men, and then raised his head and looked around suspiciously. His eyes first fell on Brando, and then his face changed. Apparently, he recognized the Count who had turned Anzaruda upside down. But then he noticed Rogers, and his eyes were slightly surprised. "I know you. Your father is Burgart. Weren't you selected to join the Royal Knight Regiment? Why are you here?" It's a long story. Rogers did not dare to reveal his true identity. He smiled bitterly and said, "I came to Anzaruda for a special mission. I didn't expect to encounter such a thing. Now, I'm almost the same as you, a prisoner of the Count. But the Count has promised to take us to a safe place. In comparison, the Count only wants a ransom. Sir Cooper, don't tell me you want to be a prisoner of those monsters." Cooper shuddered. Those monsters were murderous. He had seen with his own eyes how the caveman beheaded an aristocrat and stuck his bloody head on a spike. He hurriedly shook his head and ordered his subordinates to take off their swords and hand them over to Brendel. He then bowed to Brendel in a manner that was much calmer than the hesitant Count Jean. "Count Jean, my safety is in your hands. I have absolute trust in your words." Brando smiled. He did not know that he had any credibility in these people's hearts. The only friendship he had with these Anzaruda nobles was that he had captured a large number of hostages from them. Just half a week ago, they still called him a demon. But now, he had become the Count with outstanding credibility. Not to mention Brando, even Avram, who was hiding in the woods behind, could not help but be speechless when he saw this scene. The chubby young man could not help but turn his face and ask the Duke's daughter who was squatting in the bushes with him, "Tell me, am I dreaming, Eugenie?" The Duke's daughter's expression was very complicated, and she responded softly. Brando knew that Rogers was beating around the bush to remind Cooper of his attitude towards him, but he did not care. This knight of the inner court was very good at talking. "Sir Cooper," Rogers noticed Brando's attitude and continued, "Why are you here? Where are the others?" When Cooper heard this question, his wrinkled face crumpled into a ball. "Don't mention it. Count Alcon has been caught by those monsters." "What? The Count is not dead yet?" Rogers was taken aback and also attracted Brando's attention. As far as I know, he shouldn't be dead yet, but I can't rule out the possibility that something happened during this period that I don't know about yet." Cooper was obviously shocked by Rogers' reaction and had to carefully consider his answer. No, I thought you were all wiped out at Linya Avenue." Rogers realized that he had misunderstood and hurriedly corrected himself to explain. "Not really, but it's almost there. Cooper sighed. It's all those damn monsters' fault. That night, we were all in a hurry to rush north. These rats were waiting in the dark to ambush us. Sir Moore, who was at the front, was the first to be attacked. Sigh, poor old Moore. He was as strong as an ox. We all thought that he would live until the end of time. Things are really unpredictable. At that time, in the dark, none of us knew who the enemy was. They came from all directions, everywhere in the sky and on the ground. We were quickly defeated. I was at the southernmost side and only saw the Count and the others fleeing north across the river. And then, how did you know that Count Alcon was caught? Brando suddenly asked. I saw it with my own eyes. After I was separated from the Count that night, I have been trying to find out where the others went. Later, I learned that they went to Bureau's. Bureau's. Rogers, Trevor, and Natasha couldn't help but blurt out the name at the same time when they heard the answer. What's wrong? Cooper looked at them in confusion. Nothing, continue, Brando replied. Cooper nodded with some suspicion and continued, actually, it wasn't Bureau's. Before the Count and the others reached Bureau's, they were surrounded at the North Mountain sentry post. When I arrived there, I saw them being captured by the cavemen with my own eyes. North Mountain sentry post. But why would Count Alcon go in that direction? Rogers asked, puzzled. Bureau's is a dead end. Brando had asked Princess Magadol about Bureau's in advance. He knew that there was a crystal mine there before the Year of Thunder. However, that place prospered because of the mine, but it also declined because of the mine. Ever since the mine was cut off, the town that was famous for the mine also declined day by day and gradually became a forgotten corner. However, he thought that the Count probably wanted to find a place to hide. He knew that he couldn't be faster than the cavemen, nor did he have any delusions about breaking through the encirclement and escaping to Asgard alone. He could only hope that the first target of the underground creatures of Jorgendy Ridge was Asgard, and that they wouldn't find trouble with him. But unfortunately, things didn't go as planned. I think the Count has underestimated the size of the army of monsters. According to my observation, there are at least 4 different dungeon lords on the battlefield at Enzlova. They are confident that they can take down Asgard in the first place, and they can also spare some troops to deal with the defenders of Bureau's. Cooper shook his head. No one would have thought of that. We didn't even expect them to come. Rogers shook his head with a wry smile. Those underground rats know us too well. We don't even know who's leading them, but they know us very well. On the surface, he was just complaining, but he carefully concealed the chilling speculation in his heart. He didn't forget that the cavemen had besieged them. Although the existence of the internal court knight was a semi-open secret in the Empire, few people knew about their identities outside. The internal court knight's contact method was only in the hands of a few people. He really couldn't imagine how the cavemen found them. Was it a coincidence or a man-made factor? Several names came to his mind. If any of these names betrayed the Empire, it would be an unimaginable disaster. He could only pray and hope that it was just a prank by Lady Martha. Brando listened to the conversation between the two, but his eyes fell on the shadowy valley in the distance. He suddenly felt something and asked, "Is Count Alcon in Greystone Town now?" Cooper stopped talking and looked back at Brendel. After a while, he said, "I saw them enter Greystone Town around 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun hadn't set yet, and the long line passed through the valley. They came from the direction of the North Mountain sentry post, and I could clearly see that there were many human prisoners in the line. If the Count is not dead, I think he should be inside." Was Greystone Town captured before that? It was captured before that. Then how can you confirm whether Count Alcon and the others are still in the town, or have already left the town from the other side of the valley and been transferred to other places? Cooper opened his mouth. To be honest, I haven't thought about it. He looked at Brando in confusion. He didn't expect the young Count Erwin to think so carefully. Brando didn't care about Cooper's question. He then asked, "Have the patrolling harpies in the sky changed shifts?" "Once." The latter replied truthfully. "Then, were there any harpies in the Georgandy Ridge army that attacked Count Alcon?" "This doesn't seem to be the case." "That's right." Brando pulled the collar of the Count's trench coat to prevent the cold night wind from blowing into his collar. He stared at the valley and replied, "The Shadow Cavemen have two famous lords. One is Gerard the Wizard, and the other is Tampo. Neither of these two clans has allied with the Harpies. That is to say, the Georgandy Ridge garrison in the town has not exchanged defense with the Shadow Cavemen. They've already left." Cooper asked cautiously. "That's not necessarily true. What I mean is that there might be more than one lord's army stationed in this town." Brendel's brows were tightly knitted together. This was not good news for them. Cooper also subconsciously shut his mouth. He didn't understand what the Count was thinking. "Sir Cooper, are you sure that the Georgandy Ridge army returned from the North Mountain Sentry this afternoon?" "What do you mean by that, Count?" "My scouts won't lie to me." Cooper was a little angry because he felt questioned. "Don't be angry. I'm not doubting you, Sir Cooper. I just want to confirm one thing. Did your scouts really see the Georgandy Ridge army return to Greystone Town after attacking Count Alcon at the North Mountain Sentry?" Cooper was about to answer yes, but he only said half a word before he was stunned. Then, he looked surprised. Roger's reaction was even stronger than his. He almost jumped up and shouted, "They returned directly to Greystone Town after attacking the North Mountain Sentry. What about Buos? Were they just going for Count Alcon?" This. Cooper was at a loss. "I don't know what's going on either." Chapter 927. Brando smiled as he got the answer he wanted. He turned around and looked at Maynard, who was lying in the same direction. The latter's eyes were as sharp as a knife. She nodded at him gently. At this moment, the sun had begun to sink into the inland sea of the Empire in the west. At the last moment before sunset, the sea in the far west burned and turned into a whole piece of pure gold. But as the last ray of light sank below the sea level, the golden water was quickly dissipating, leaving only a dark red color, like a casting that was gradually cooling. From the west to the east, Greystone Town was surrounded by rolling hills. On a cloudless day, the view in the sky was extremely wide, especially the Anzaruta Mountains in the distance and the endless plains in the east formed a magnificent picture. But after dusk fell, the distant mountains seemed to be shrouded in a layer of twilight, becoming hazy, like an impressionist oil painting. The boundary between the sky and the earth was shrouded in a layer of orange halo and clouds, becoming blurred. But all of this eventually returned to the silent night. As the light dimmed, the creatures who were used to the darkness could see more clearly. The harpies hovering above the town seemed to have noticed the unusual movement on the nearby hills. They circled the hills for a long time while squeaking. But before they could attract the attention of others, a sudden commotion broke out in Greystone Town. Loud noises came from a few streets. The noise and clamor attracted the attention of the feathered beasts again. They turned around and flew back into the town. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation in Greystone Town, the subterranean dwellers were capturing residents, Imperial soldiers, adventurers, and other dangerous people who were hiding. They were not used to the daytime, so the search began in the evening, and soon the town was in a mess. On the second floor of the Bullfrog's Cry Inn, the smelly searchers had just left. Suddenly, a cloak was lifted among a pile of debris. It was as if a door was opened in the wall, and a small figure appeared behind it. In the dark room, a pair of lake-like green eyes appeared. The eyes were big and clear. It blinked gently, and then a look of relief appeared on its face. It was a little girl wearing a dark green cloak, but the cloak was a little strange. It was obviously an adult's traveling cloak. Only the hem was cut to fit her small stature so that it did not drag to the ground. However, the huge hood could not be changed, so the little girl had to hold the edge of the hood from time to time to prevent it from drooping down and blocking her view. It looked very funny. Under the huge hood, the little girl's light silver hair was tied into two short ponytails behind her pointed ears. It seemed to be the only distinguishing feature of her identity. Generally speaking, such a half-elf with wild elf blood could only be seen in the north of the Greyhues Knights Legion, or even further north in Eloranta. In addition, she carried a crossbow that was almost half her height and wore a pair of short leather boots with feathers stuck to the left and right sides of the boots. The little girl stood on her tiptoes and just happened to put her chin on the window lattice. She looked up and stared at the harpies in the air until they flew away again. Then, she struggled to climb up the desk, knelt on the desk, opened the window, and quietly glanced at the street below. The cavemen were already far away. She closed the window and answered with a trembling voice, "Jude, Jude, is it far away?" "That seems to be the case." "They didn't notice us?" a small voice asked curiously. A small, triangular head appeared under the wide hood. This little thing looked a little like a giant dragon thousands of times smaller. It even had the same horns, sharp teeth, and folded wing membranes. However, it was not a dragon, but a pseudo-dragon. Wond had very little information about this strange species. They were only mentioned in a few legends and biographies. Scholars on the shores of the abyssal sea thought that they were the spirits of books and knowledge, and they were often accompanied by books. However, this was only to satisfy their curiosity about the world. For the same reason, they would accompany mortals and go on adventures in various parts of the world. The little elf is scared. This place is not fun at all. These people are bad. They are not friendly to the little elf at all. You reap what you sow. From the moment you broke their catapult, you shouldn't have expected them to be friendly to you. Jude replied snappily. The little elf looked a little scared. She hurriedly explained, I didn't see what it was. I just wanted to touch it. Then you didn't have to cut the rope. But I have a feeling that if I cut the rope, something terrible will happen. Jude replied in a shrill voice, It did happen, and then we became wanted criminals. Before that, we still have to hide from place to place. The little elf pouted. Before coming here, Shania didn't tell me about these strange things. Didn't you say that this is a human kingdom? Yes, it was before I left last time. When was that? About 300 years ago. Let's not talk about that for now. The little elf pulled Jude off her head and stuffed her into her pocket, ignoring the latter's protests. You really saw that thing? Yes, I saw it. It was that bastard who brought us down from the sky. I would recognize her even if she turned into ashes. Jude finally escaped from the little elf's clutches. She poked her head out of the pocket and replied, If you didn't make such a big commotion, I would have caught up with her long ago. I'm sorry. The little elf replied, feeling wronged. Jude replied proudly, Fortunately, I was smart enough to put a magic mark on that thing. As long as she hasn't left the city, I will be able to find her. She gestured with her claws a few times on the little elf's body. Let me see. She didn't go far. She's just nearby. There. Where is she? Lift me up. Jude ordered. The elf took her out of her pocket and carried her to the window with both hands. She looked out at the street and pointed to one of the roofs. There, she said, do you see that roof over there in the east? She's in the attic over there. The little elf leaned against the window and looked out for a while. Oh, I know. She's hiding in that candy shop. What candy shop? The one we went to the other day. The chubby owner. There were 4 strange arrows on the sign over the door. Don't you remember? "Oh, I remember now," said Sydney. "But it wasn't a confectionery, it was a bakery, and those 4 queer arrowheads were compasses. Rove's compasses, you see, I remember the name of them." "Oh, no. We have to go through 2 streets to get there. I remember one of those stinky bastard sentries. What are we to do?" "They'll catch you as soon as you show your face. They'll prepare a big pot for you. They'll make soup out of the little elf with salt, onions, and carrots." "Never mind. They won't find us if we go that way." "Which way?" The little elf climbed down from the desk. There was not a single bit of light in the dark inn, but her green eyes flashed in the darkness, not affected in the slightest. She opened the door and went down the hall, up the stairs to the ground floor, and into the kitchen, which had a cellar covered with thick planks of cabbage and potatoes. "What is this place?" Jude asked. "There's a secret passage down here that leads to the candy shop opposite." "The baker's workshop," Shani corrected, but then she asked, "Why is there a secret passage in the inn leading to the baker's workshop?" The elf shook her head. "I heard the innkeeper talking to a woman about it." "A woman?" "A very beautiful woman. She gave me a piece of candy." "You mean you eavesdropped on them, and she gave you a piece of candy?" Jude asked incredulously. "No. I was standing so far away that they thought I couldn't hear them. But the little elf heard them clearly." "Don't you feel any guilt?" The elf obviously didn't have that kind of superfluous thing. She pushed the cabbage and potatoes off the planks, which tumbled to the ground. Then she lifted the planks to reveal a dark staircase. There was indeed a secret passage under the cellar, and the entrance was hidden behind a row of wine racks. The passage was long, dark, and winding. She did not know how many turns it had taken, but it was still up and down. In some places, water had accumulated and dripped, but the elf was not afraid at all. She looked around curiously, as if she was on an adventure. In fact, it was indeed an adventure. However, no matter how long the passageway was, there was always an end. Soon, the man and the dragon groped their way to an iron door. The iron door was tightly shut, without a single gap. Jude was about to fly to the door handle to cast a spell, but the elf grabbed her tail. "Wait, there's someone behind us." "Ouch! Don't grab my tail!" Jude screamed. The elf put a finger to her lips. Shoo! A moment later there was a rumbling sound from behind the iron door. It sounded like someone was dragging something. The noise lasted for a while before it stopped. Then there was the sound of footsteps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the elf counted. The 6 of them entered the room one by one. Then there was the sound of the door closing. Jude was startled. "Are they coming in?" The elf shook her head. "They're not coming," she said as if she had seen it herself. There was a moment of silence behind the door. Then there was a man's voice. "Miss Delphian, we've come at a bad time. We don't know where those things came from. Please make a decision. We can't stay here any longer. We know of a secret passage in the city that leads to the lower reaches of the surging Milky Way. But if we're late, those monsters will find it." A soft female voice replied, "I know where these things came from. That person has a group of subterranean dwellers in his territory, which shows that his relationship with Jorgendy Ridge is not ordinary. They have been plotting this for a long time, but no one thought that he would actually dare to make a move against the Empire." The elf heard the voice from the other end of the passage. "It's her," she said to Jude. "It's that woman." The elf nodded. She thought for a moment and said, "I know. She must be the owner of the candy shop. Do people call the owner of the candy shop Miss in your hometown?" Jude sneered. "She's in the candy shop. Of course she's the owner. Good logic." At this time, a young voice spoke from behind the door. Elman must have seen through that person's scheme in the loop of trade winds. That's why he was killed. Thank you, Mr. F. That person is treacherous and cunning. I've asked Andesha. If he didn't leave Elman and the others behind, she wouldn't have had the chance to act. That woman is detestable, but some hypocrites deserve to be judged. Elman swore to protect me for his entire life. Now that he's gone, I'm still his wife. I'll avenge him. The first voice sighed. Ah, Miss Delphian. Don't worry. No matter how long you stay here, we'll protect you. Thank you, Mr. Solons. You're welcome. The subterranean dwellers attacked the North Mountain sentry post today. That place has no value to them. If they were going after bureaus, it might make sense, but they only attacked the North Mountain sentry post, the young voice spoke. The subterranean dwellers won't do meaningless things. But I heard that Count Alcon is in that place. That person has a grudge with the nobles in the south of the empire, so I'm guessing that he's most likely with the subterranean dwellers. Our people have also heard that there's a mysterious human beside Tonpu, the rough male voice replied. Then it's most likely him. Why would a normal person be with those monsters, especially at this time of the year? A new voice spoke. It was a slightly hoarse voice. Can you find out where Tonpu and his whereabouts are? The woman asked. That's not difficult. These monsters are probably used to the underground tunnels. They're not used to our buildings. We can easily get close to their base. Very well. Find a way to set up ambushes on his path. Don't get too close. That person is very powerful. The young voice spoke again. No matter how powerful he is, he won't be able to dodge the Demon Slayer spear. There's no harm in being careful, the rough male voice reminded. Then the others chatted with each other for a while. Most of them were talking about recent events. Xianni and the little fairy who were leaning against the door quickly lost interest. The chatter behind the door gradually died down. Then there was the sound of things being dragged away. Finally, there was the sound of the door slamming shut. Everything returned to normal. Have they left? Xianni asked after a while. The two carefully pushed open the iron door. Behind the door was a small room filled with all kinds of junk. Wooden boxes, barrels, broken cabinets, and iron shelves. The little fairy looked around and whispered, "Do you understand what they're saying? Nothing more than revenge. I've seen many humans, and they're all like that." Xianni flapped her wings a few times and landed on the little fairy's shoulder. "They're so boring. Let's not care about them. We'll go find that bad guy and take revenge ourselves." "I feel like you're scolding us too. How could that be? We're avenging for justice. We're different from them. What's different about us?" "You're not allowed to speak anymore, Xianni. One is marked by the company one keeps." The little elf had learned how to get angry out of humiliation without anyone teaching her. The two walked up the stairs to the basement. They quietly pushed open the door to the basement. Outside the door was still a dark corridor. The Cruise people's talent in architecture seemed to be limited to connecting the corridor, the room, the stairs, and finally the outer wall. There was no creativity at all. They carefully passed by the first floor of the bakery. There was no one living there. The rooms were empty, as if they had been swept clean. There was also the unique smell of the cavemen. "Do you know how to go up to the attic?" Xianni asked, covering her nose with her claws. The little fairy didn't care at all. She sniffed around with her sharp little nose as if she was a little hunting dog. Then she replied, "Of course I know." "How do you know? Have you been here before?" "Yes, I sneaked up once." "When?" Xianni asked in surprise. "When you weren't there, there was a wild grape rack behind the house. It was easy to climb, the little fairy replied in a low voice. But then I accidentally got caught on the curtain and fell down and crushed the grape rack. After that, I couldn't climb up again. After that, you went up several times. Why did you go up there? The little elf replied, I want to go up and see where that chubby guy hid the bread. Xianni snorted at the answer. You wanted to steal the bread, didn't you? Xianni blushed a little. He didn't want to sell it to us. Have you ever seen anyone who doesn't pay for something? But I don't have money. Oh. Xianni scratched her face with her two little claws. Poor thing. Let's make a deal. What? If you're caught by Aquissa this time, don't tell her that I took you out. Why? Because I don't want to die. Chapter 9:28. The two girls walked up the stairs to the second floor while bickering, but their voices were as soft as their bodies, so no one noticed them. The second floor was still a long corridor, with several rooms on both sides. The doors were closed, and it was dark inside. It was hard to guess if the people behind the rooms were the same. But it was most likely, because when the two girls tiptoed past some of the doors, they heard faint voices talking behind them. Logically speaking, they should quickly pass through such a dangerous place, but the little elf was interested in listening to the voices inside the room one by one. In the first room, there was the voice of the previous rough man and the voice of the young man called F. The two seemed to be discussing the previous plan, but she couldn't understand a single word, so she left the room in disappointment and went to the next door. Sunil leaned on her shoulder and didn't stop her. Instead, she asked curiously, "Who's inside?" The little elf shook her head, indicating that there was no voice inside. She continued to move forward. In the third door, there were two voices that she hadn't heard before. She guessed that they were the two people who hadn't spoken. These two are the guards of the owner's wife. After listening for a while, she said to Sunil as if she had discovered a secret, "This candy shop must be very popular. Even the owner's wife has guards." "Because she's not the owner's wife," Sunil replied. "Why? Why do you say that?" The little elf raised her eyebrows and asked. "All right, I won't argue with you. If you say so, then so be it." The two girls continued to move forward and came to the fourth door, which was also the last door. Not far away was the end of the corridor, where there was a staircase leading to the attic. The little elf stood in front of the door and listened carefully with her pointed ears. Not long after, she heard a strange voice. It seems that someone is talking. "Is it the old man and the woman?" Sunil asked. The little elf listened and said, "No, it's the old man and the other old man." "How can it be? Then there are 7 people. Maybe one of them didn't go down before. They need someone to keep a lookout." "What are they talking about?" Xianni asked after a moment's thought. The first old man was reporting something to the second old man. The second old man asked the first old man how it was going. The first old man said that it was going well. Then, they said something that even the little elf couldn't understand. Something about "long live." It was really strange. Then the second old man urged the first old man to hurry up. The second old man seemed to be complaining about something. "Enough, enough. You're making me dizzy," Sydney interrupted. "Can't you put it in simpler terms?" "But I don't understand what they're talking about." Shani glared at her. "You're such an idiot." Boris Anvil had a resounding name. As a dwarf, he was a member of the famous Anvil family. But unlike his brethren who dug tunnels in the mountains, he yearned for the outside world and not the dull and boring tunnels. In the eyes of everyone, he was an anomaly, which was why he left his people early on and ventured into the human world. Now, he was an alchemist with some reputation. He had a respectable status, received a generous pension, and lived a good life that his compatriots in the tunnels couldn't even imagine. He didn't regret his choice at all. In fact, he was proud of it. But that didn't mean that everything went smoothly. Sometimes, he still had to face some troublesome matters. For example, at this moment, he had no choice but to grumble and grumble as he erased the magic circle on the table. Even if someone gave him 500 eagle coins, he wouldn't want to look at that damned face anymore. Damn it! He muttered to himself. He makes it sound so easy. You just have to do this and that. Damn it, why didn't he try it himself? He couldn't help but grumble, I'm an alchemist, not a spy. Those guys are the real spies. As long as I'm a little careless, they will drag me out, peel my skin, and pull out my tendons. I dare to swear in the name of Mother Earth that those cold-blooded people won't even blink an eye. Damn it, if I wasn't blinded by greed, I wouldn't have gotten involved in this mess. Well, even if that's the case, don't think that Uncle Boris is easy to mess with. If you dare to nag at me like this again, Uncle Boris won't do it. I'll let you fools understand that the men of the Anvil family won't be moved by mere silk. The dwarven alchemist opened the drawer as he spoke. Inside the drawer were bottles and jars of potions that he had refined. Of course, these were the less expensive types of potions, which was why he dared to temporarily store them here. As for the truly precious potions, Boris had always kept them close to his body. He took out a green paper package and carefully opened it. It was a portion of sleeping dragon dust. Wizards often use small doses of this potion as incense to induce meditation, but in fact, large doses of sleeping dragon dust had a very strong hypnotic effect. Moreover, this alchemy potion was not rare, so alchemists liked to use it for self-protection. Although Boris had inherited the loud voice and bad temper of the dwarves, he rarely possessed the meticulousness of an alchemist. At the same time, he was like most people who dealt with magic. They all had one thing in common, they cherished their lives very much. Therefore, before going to bed every day, he used to make a simple trap with the sleeping dragon dust to prevent any thieves from stealing his things or even killing him for money. He picked up the sleeping dragon dust, but still felt uneasy, so he grabbed a seed of the shining tree from the drawer and stuffed it into the pouch. Then, he walked towards the door. But on this day, when he carried the sleeping dragon dust to the door as usual, he unexpectedly heard two chattering voices outside the door. Nonsense, you're the idiot. Judy didn't understand. That's because your description was too bad. Judy, who can't even understand the description of the elves, is useless. Then there's no one in this world who can be useful. Lawless. Boris thought to himself. He subconsciously thought that there were two thieves outside his door. Even burglars dare to openly discuss how to split the loot in front of the victim's door, and even brazenly argue. Do they really think that there's no justice here just because the rats of Georgandy Ridge are here? The dwarf angrily opened the door, and the door opened with a click, revealing a human and a dragon outside. The two of them were bickering at the door without any sense of crisis. They didn't expect the door to suddenly open. They were both stunned. A little elf, a pseudo-dragon, and an old dwarf holding the sleeping dragon's dust. The three of them just stood there and looked at each other, speechless. Who are you? Boris was stunned. No matter how much the dwarf grumbled, he would not think that the inexplicably cute little girl outside his door was a burglar. But just as he opened his mouth, a gust of cold wind suddenly blew in from outside his room. The winter wind was so cold that the dwarf could not help but shiver. The little elf opposite him opened her mouth wide. Achoo! Boris sneezed a little, and a cloud of green smoke suddenly spread out from his hand and shrouded him. The little elf opened her eyes, and just as she saw this scene, the dwarf alchemist fell to the floor with a thud. The sound of the dwarf falling to the ground was so heavy that a vigilant voice immediately came from the next room. Who's outside? Both the elf and Judy opened their mouths wide. Obviously, they did not expect to mess things up. They were discovered. That was their first thought. What should they do? That was their second thought, and there was no third thought. The two seemed to be petrified. Those people would definitely open the door and come out to check, and at this time, it would be too late for them to run to the attic, not to mention there were people upstairs. For a moment, they were at a loss and did not know what to do. The sound of several doorknobs turning came from the corridor at the same time, and the little elf was so scared that her face turned ashen. Use the cloak. Judy screamed to remind her. Boris seemed to have just reacted and quickly pulled up the cloak to cover himself and Judy. In a flash, the two figures disappeared from the corridor. The first to open the door and come out was Delphian. Judy had heard the elf describe this woman as very beautiful, but when she saw her face, she realized that it was true. The human girl was wearing a violet dress, and her long hair was tied in a waterfall to her waist. Her hair was the color of black sandalwood. In Cruz and Erwin, only people with the blood of the Myrnas could have such pure hair color. Black in the culture of the Cruz people represented mystery and misfortune, but it complemented her quiet temperament. Her eyes were like the stars in the night sky, her nose seemed to be carved out of jade, and her slightly pursed lips had a charm that could make any man go crazy. She stood there, her perfect figure could not be hidden even by the darkness of the night. Even if some people thought that she was the goddess of the night, it seemed to be a matter of course. The others opened the door one after another, and a tall and strong man with a two-handed sword on his back came out. Two men dressed as guards, and a young man in a silver robe. When the four saw Boris on the ground, they could not help but exclaim in a low voice. Boris! What happened? The two-handed swordsman reacted the fastest. He pulled out his greatsword and rushed to the door of the dwarf alchemist's room. But when he looked inside, the room was empty. It didn't look like someone had broken in. But of course, he didn't expect that beside him, the little elf and Judy were hugging each other, shivering. Although the elf's cloak could hide them, it couldn't move. There weren't any obstacles in the corridor, so if these people took a few steps forward, they might bump into them. Delphian frowned, looked at the stairs leading to the attic and said, "Go up and check." Her voice just fell, and the elf and Judy almost hugged each other and burst into tears. Because the two of them were hiding at the stairs leading to the attic, as long as these people passed by, it was impossible not to find them. Hearing Delphian's order, the tall swordsman immediately put away his sword and turned to the attic. But before he could take a step, a cold voice came from the attic. "If I were you, I would choose to stay there obediently." This sudden voice startled everyone. But Xianni was trying her best to signal the elf with her eyes. She remembered clearly that this was the voice that had knocked them down from the sky. Delphian heard this voice, first signaled the swordsman to stop, then raised her head and asked, "Who are you, sir? What did you do to Boris?" The attic was silent for a moment. Then the voice replied, "I am the same as you, a temporary guest here. As for what happened to your companion, it has nothing to do with me." At this time, the tall swordsman had taken the opportunity to check the status of the dwarf alchemist. He found that the dwarf was lying on the floor, sleeping soundly, and did not seem to be injured. He used his hand to touch some of the green powder on the floor, then sniffed and showed a look of understanding. "It's the sleeping dragon's dust." "Boris is careful, he would never make such a mistake," Delphian replied as soon as she heard this. "Even if the sleeping dragon's dust is his own, something must have happened just now. When I came out, I clearly heard the voice of someone else. Lady in the attic, I don't mean to offend you, but I think you must know what happened just now, right?" When the two hiding under the cloak heard this sentence, they knew who she was talking about. They did not expect that the guy in the attic was so powerful that he even knew everything that happened below like the back of his hand. When the two thought of their purpose of coming here, they could not help but tremble in fear. Of course, it was nothing, but the more they trembled, the more they trembled. In the end, even the people outside could see it. When the swordsman with the two-handed greatsword saw the distortion in the air, he thought that it was a spatial turbulence and was startled. He quickly stepped back, but then he realized that something was wrong. "Mr. Solons, what's wrong?" Delphian frowned. The swordsman did not answer. Instead, he used his sword to flick the two elves in front of everyone. At that moment, they were both wronged and scared. They could not help but burst into tears. "Wah wah wah, don't kill me, mother. I'm going to die." Everyone stared at this scene with their mouths agape. Delphian seemed to have finally recognized the little one in front of her. "It's you," she said in surprise, but suddenly realized something and frowned. "You were eavesdropping on us." I didn't, woo-woo." The little elf panicked and denied. "Mr. Solons, catch her first," Delphian said a little angrily. "Ah, don't catch me." The little elf was obviously scared out of her wits. She ran up the stairs with tears and snot running down her face. Shani also flew up to block her path. "Little elf, run. I'll stop them." Unfortunately, before she could finish her sentence, Solons grabbed her wings. False dragon. At first, the swordsman thought that Shani was just a lizard. But as soon as she spoke, he immediately recognized the rare creature. False dragons were very knowledgeable and had high intelligence. They could even cast some small spells. It could be said that they were the rarest magic pet of a wizard. He could not help but shout in surprise. "You're lucky, Miss Delphian. Let me go, you're hurting me, damn big guy." Shani screamed. The little elf's face changed when she heard this. Shani was her best friend. She would not let them take her away. "Let go of Shani." She suddenly turned around and rammed into the tall swordsman. Unfortunately, her small body didn't have any deterrent force. When she rammed into the swordsman's waist, she bounced off and landed on her but beside Bolly the dwarf. The two guards and the young man beside Delphian could not help but laugh at the scene. The little elf was scared and angry, but she was more afraid that these people would take Shani away. She took out a dagger with tears in her eyes and threw it at the big guy. Unfortunately, Solons did not even look at it. He flicked the soft dagger away with his hand. She then took off her sword, crossbow bolts, and even flints and threw them at Solons. These things did not hurt him at all, and he was too lazy to care about them. After all, he was a famous swordsman. Naturally, he would not care about a little girl. After the elf finished throwing her things, she grabbed a paper bag from the dwarf beside her and threw it at him. The paper bag hit Solons and scattered into a cloud of red smoke. This time, Solons, who was unprepared, was in big trouble. "Pori's chili powder." He shouted and immediately let go of Shani. He covered his eyes and nose, but tears were already streaming down his face. Shani took the opportunity to fly to the little elf side and looked at the scene with lingering fear. "Damn it, you guys, stop her." This time, it was Solons' turn to shout with tears and snot. He was ashamed and angry. He did not expect to be tricked by a little girl in a moment of carelessness. Delphine looked at this scene and frowned. After receiving a nod from her, the two guards beside her smiled and approached the elf from both sides. The little elf was terrified. When she realized that the thing on Bolly's body was very useful, she immediately groped around the poor old dwarf's body. Not long after, she pulled out a round, spherical object from the dwarf's pouch. The others were fine, but the young man behind Delphine could not help but change his expression when he saw the object. "Don't lose it," he shouted, but unfortunately, the little fairy obviously couldn't do as he wished. When she heard this shout, her hand trembled in fright, and she directly threw the ball at the young man. "Close your eyes," the young man shouted angrily. Chapter 929. Half an hour ago. Compared to the commotion in Greystone Town, the nearby hills were quiet. On the top of the hill where Erwin's delegation was, everyone was quietly waiting in the pine forest. Due to the fear of the harpies circling in the sky, no one dared to light a fire or do anything out of the ordinary. They even had to speak softly. Everyone was waiting for the sky to turn completely dark. But before that, time became extraordinarily dull and long. Some people were whispering, some were eating dry food to maintain their strength. In the forest, for Knight of the Inner Court were discussing the matter of the North Mountain sentry post. Romain was telling a story to the Grand Duke of Grenoir's daughter. The latter looked at Romain with admiration. Romain had a special ability to tell stories that had not happened yet. She was talking about her merchant group, the merchant ships with huge sails that looked like clouds crossing the shining sea, following the waterway to the bustling port and the wild areas. She talked about the giant beasts that lurked in the distant sea, the storms that brewed on the surface of the sea, the strange fish, and the wonders that were rarely seen in a mortal's life. Although she had never been to those places, she talked about them as if she had seen them with her own eyes. Soon, other people gathered around her. Brando saw Sugarpot, Dilfary, and Hippamra, the three loyal Roman listeners. Then, Chiara and Princess Magadal joined in. The Duke's daughter was counting the stars with Enide. The strange starry sky of Wonde always shone from the east to the west. The night sky was like a black cloth sprinkled with gemstone fragments, shining brightly. A long river of stars had faintly appeared, as if announcing the final arrival of the night. But when the light of the stars and the moon converged, the outside of the forest became brighter, and the silvery valley emitted a faint light under the night sky. Before night fell, Brendel had been asking Cooper about the situation in Greystone Town. The latter also wanted to take advantage of the night to break out of the encirclement, but the defenses in Greystone Town were very tight. Not to mention other things, there was nothing he could do about the harpies in the sky. He did not know much about the current situation in Greystone Town. When Brando asked, he could only vaguely answer a few questions. But as a local noble, he knew Greystone Town very well. He knew where the market was, where the open streets were, where the barracks and towers were, and where the Holy Cathedral was. He knew all about it and could even draw a simple map. Brando's questions were very detailed, which made Cooper very puzzled. He could not help but ask, "Count, are you sure you can take Greystone Town?" "It's hard to say. Everything will only be known after nightfall," Brando replied. "Count, the Jorgendy Ridge troops stationed in Greystone Town are not weaker than us. They have the advantage of defense. The individual combat power of the harpies and cavemen is also stronger than our swordsmen and spearmen. Of course, they may not be as strong as your army, but according to my observation, you didn't bring many guards with you, right?" Cooper asked carefully. In Aween, especially in the south, the noble spearmen were at most equivalent to the first tier of soldiers, and their average standard was even lower than the infantry swordsmen and spearmen of the local legions. But in Kurlutz, the nobles' private soldiers were slightly stronger, and could be compared to the swordsmen of the first and second tier legions in Aween. They belonged to the second tier of soldiers like the subterranean dwellers, but there were differences in strength between the same tier of soldiers. The subterranean dwellers belonged to the upper middle tier of the second tier of soldiers, while the Kurlutz noble spearmen and swordsmen could at most be considered as a second tier of soldiers. The human army was slightly better in terms of discipline, but in terms of individual combat power, the difference was too great. The advantage of discipline was often obvious in large legions, but in small-scale battles and ambushes, individual strength could determine the outcome of a battle. Not to mention, there were harpies and razor boars in Jorgendy Ridge, which were true rank 3 creatures. If there were one or two nest lords or minotaurs in the town, it would be a disaster for the noble's army. The Shadow Cavemen were not considered strong in the underground of Georgandy Ridge, but at the same scale, they were comparable to the local army of crews. Like the lords that Brando was familiar with in history, such as Trock, King of the Blind, Shadek, or Beast Tamer, Silica, their armies could fight against the border army of the Kingdom of God. As for existences like Geralt and Medusa, if they went all out, even the frontline army of the Kingdom of God might not be able to deal with them alone. "Nate, what do you think we should do?" Brando asked. "I think we should think of a way to go around them. We have fewer people, and they might not be able to find us if we walk through the hills." Cooper thought for a moment and answered hesitantly, as if even he felt that his suggestion was not that reliable. Brando smiled and shook his head. It was impossible for 1,000 or 2,000 people to march through the hills without being discovered. Not to mention 1,000 or 2,000 people, even if 100 or 200 people were to move, no matter how dense the trees were, they would not be able to hide. Unless everyone was in groups of a few and scattered into the hills, but that would require a lot of space and time. They did not have the time to do that now. "If we don't get rid of the garrison of Greystone Town, we won't be able to leave this place safely." Cooper sighed and felt a little hopeless. "Do we have to fight? Is there no other way?" Brando saw that he was scared out of his wits by the people of Georgandy Ridge, so he could only comfort him. "Knight Cooper, Greystone Town is not as hard to conquer as you think." Cooper only took it as consolation and nodded, glancing listlessly in the direction of the valley. Heroes walked through the dark forest, as if attracted by the light outside. He held on to the pine trees with his hands and struggled to walk out. Finally, he saw Lysimachia at the edge of the forest. Medusa stood on the edge of the bushes, staring at the white rocks exposed under the moonlight. But the little prince saw that at the same level as the rocks were the shadows entrenched in the valley. That place was called Greystone Town, or so his teacher had told him. Geographically, it was the exit of the valley, but he knew that the town was occupied by some special enemies at the moment. "Are those your compatriots, Sister Lysimachia?" He walked up behind Medusa and asked in a low voice. "Compatriots?" "Not really," Lysimachia replied, having heard the little prince's voice. Heroes looked at her, puzzled. Lysimachia looked back at the little prince with a hint of gentleness in her amber eyes. "Little cutie, in the human language, Georgandy Ridge is actually just a geographical term, not a country or territory. The real Georgandy Ridge is actually divided into 3 layers, upper, middle, and lower. Each layer is different. The rulers of the shallowest layer are the dwarves, the middle layer is the Georgandy Ridge you are familiar with, the bottom layer is the kingdom of the dark elves, and further down is the river flowing with magma and sulfur. In the dark underground world, there are thousands of different ethnic groups. They have never had any concept of a country. Even the most powerful lords often only rule a city and a territory. The smaller tribes are dependent on the lord. Since the beginning of history, everyone has been fighting for themselves and hostile to each other." She sighed as she spoke, and Heroes vaguely felt that he should not have mentioned these things, so he stopped asking. After sending Cooper away, Brando returned to Maynard's side and looked at the scene at the edge of the woodland from a distance. "What about that Medusa?" he asked, looking back. "Her Royal Highness promised to shelter her." "His Royal Highness seems to like her very much," Maynard replied, but she did not look over there, as if she did not care about it at all. "No problem. It's not a big problem. Don't forget that she came with the demon." Brando nodded. In the middle and lower levels of Georgandy Ridge, the natives were feuding with the demon, but there were also a small number of people who had to serve the demon. They were the demon's slaves. With this background, and the fact that she had personally sent the little prince back, it was not without reason that Griffin trusted her so much. There was a moment of silence between the two, looking silently in the direction of the valley. The wind blowing from the hills rubbed the entire pine forest over their heads and rustled. "It's getting dark earlier and earlier," Maynard suddenly said. "Because it's almost late winter." Maynard glanced at him. The meteor fell near the North Mountain sentry post. There are many witnesses, and most people's testimonies can prove this, but most of them don't believe it's true. They generally think it's a trick of Georgandy Ridge. The cavemen are looking for it. Brando nodded. Although most people thought that they were going for Earl Alcorn, he already had the answer in his heart. Maynard looked at him quietly with eyes as quiet as an orchid. Could it be that thing? We'll know soon enough. So confident. That night doubted that you could take this place. Maynard thought of Cooper's face and could not help but curl her lips. Unfortunately, Brando did not notice. He smiled after hearing it. Don't you know what's going on? Although there are many famous generals in this era, we also have our own means. You want to say, players? Brando did not want to answer this question rashly. He had been thinking about all this for the past few days. Was history tending to happen or changing? If it was the latter, what was the opportunity? The night was getting darker and darker. It was obviously unrealistic to approach Greystone Town under the watchful eyes of the Harpies before the sky turned completely dark. The eyesight of these monsters was comparable to their distant relatives on the surface. In fact, not to mention the valley, as long as one walked out of the dense canopy, there was a possibility that they would be targeted by them. As a reconnaissance unit among the flying units, the Harpies were also ranked among the top in Wound. In terms of reconnaissance ability, even the gargoyles of Buga were slightly inferior to them. However, they were very fragile. They were used to jumping between underground rock formations, and their short wings were very weak in the air. This made them very weak in the air, which made them very weak in the air. However, it was also wishful thinking to get close to Greystone Town after nightfall. Harpies were creatures of the dark. In fact, their eyesight at night was better than during the day. This was because they had slight light blindness, which made it difficult for them to adapt to the daylight of the surface world. According to the Shire, the only way to quietly get close to Greystone Town was for everyone to learn invisibility, if they could find so many wizards to cast spells for more than 1,000 people hidden in the forest. It seemed that the only way was to attack. However, the players were especially good at this kind of small-scale unconventional battle, so Brando and Maynard's choice was usually not that troublesome. When the hour hand on Sir Cooper's silver pocket watch passed the 12 mark, it seemed that there was a breeze in the forest. A small group of gargoyles was taking off from the forest at the top of the mountain. However, looking from above the forest, only the dark canopy could be seen shaking slightly, and the branches seemed to be slightly lowered by the descending airflow. A total of 7 or 8 invisible airwaves swept across the canopy and then disappeared. Under the canopy, the wizards in robes were watching the gargoyles that were enchanted with invisibility take off. Beside them, there was a second group of gargoyles waiting to take off. These gargoyles were like statues in the forest when they were not activated, and their folded wings were almost taller than the treetops. These were the backups of the first group of gargoyles. If possible, everyone present sincerely hoped that they could succeed in one go and not use these backups. Under the cover of the night, it seemed that Martha was on their side, and the plan went far more smoothly than expected. 8 invisible gargoyles rose into the night sky and began to climb. They quickly flew into the clouds and arrived above the Harpies in the sky above Greystone Town. The moonlight poured over the clouds, and looking down through the veil-like gaps of the clouds, one could clearly see 4 black dots that were flying in circles. The Harpies did not have the slightest premonition of the approaching danger. They were circling in the air in pairs, using their sharp eyes to observe the vast land. In their vision, the mountains and hills gathered under the starlight and moonlight were like miniature sandboxes. The hills were shrouded in a silver mist, and it seemed quiet. At this moment, the 8 gargoyles had already locked on to their targets. After they climbed to the highest point, they began to make the final turn and then swooped down. Gargoyles, like the griffins, were heavy flying units, and their wingspans were far wider and stronger than the griffins. This meant that they had the strongest climbing and diving ability among creatures of the same level. In the game, the gargoyles were the Tier 3 troop class closest to the Tier 4 troop class, the griffins were the Tier 4 troop class, and the harpies were the Tier 4 troop class closest to the Tier 3 troop class. The balance of the three flying creatures was almost the same, but in terms of scouting ability, the gargoyles were no match for the harpies, and in terms of fighting, the gargoyles were no match for the ferocious griffins. However, in terms of climbing and diving speed, the Buga gargoyles deserved to be called number one. Needless to say, the gargoyles that swooped down from the clouds were still invisible, and the four harpies did not know that disaster was coming from the sky. They only reacted in a panic when the sharp whistling sound reached their ears. But it was a pity. It was too late. The precision of the construct allowed the 8 gargoyles to enter the attack range at the same time, and when they showed their intention to attack, the harpies did not have any reaction at all. They struggled futilely in midair, and then the cold claws pierced through their fragile sternum. The 8 gargoyles were almost arranged in a sequence of attack, one in front and one behind, to prevent any fish from escaping, but it turned out that this was just an unnecessary move. The gargoyles swept past, and a rain of feathers fell in midair. It was a pity that they were too high above the ground, and the feathers fluttered in the air. By the time they landed, they had already drifted to God knows where. In the dark night, no one noticed that the battle in the sky had ended before it even began. The people waiting anxiously on the ground received the message from the gargoyles at the same time. Rogers could not help but excitedly high-five his companions, and the wizards in the forest also high-fived one after another to congratulate him. But at the same time, on the other side of the hill, groups of elves wearing feathered cloaks, wearing clothes that were different from humans, and holding long staffs walked out of the forest. Their faces were painted with various patterns, and they looked like barbarians in the mountains, but their pointed ears exposed their identity, tree elven druids. A small group of tree elves had already joined Brando's Mage Legion during the Autumn Twilight War in Erewhon. After the war, more and more tree elves came out of the Black Forest and settled in his territory. This was originally part of the agreement between him and the Druids in the Loop of Trade Winds, and with the departure of the Mage Legion with Erewhon's envoy, these tree elves also came to Cruz's land. They faced the night wind and chanted ancient spells, and then one by one, they turned into birds or ravens and flew out of the forest in flocks, flying down the valley in the direction of Greystone Town. Migratory birds often migrated in the areas near the Sea of the Empire, and even in the inland areas, it was not rare to see a flock of ravens wandering on the hills. However, the Druids still chose to scatter and enter the town safely. After losing the eyes in the sky, the army of Jorgendy Ridge could not notice these scattered flocks of birds. The Druids flew into the city and landed in the dark places, dead ends, deep alleys, or secluded courtyards. Then, they turned back into human form in a cloud of green light. A few druids in a group took out blue stones from their pockets and placed them on the ground according to a certain pattern, forming large and small magic circles. Next, they began to infuse magic into these stones. Green beams of light extended between the stones like snakes. When each stone was connected together, the space above the magic circle began to vibrate. From the center of the circle, a shining silver line appeared. This silver line expanded to both sides like an open eye in the void, but this eye had no pupil. There was only a strange space shining with blue and white light inside. At this moment, far away in the hills, more than a dozen light gates opened, appearing in front of the White Lion guards and the Kurlut's noble private soldiers who were ready to go. Everyone was stunned by the scene in front of them. The Buga's teleportation circle. Rogers exclaimed. He looked at Brando with a complicated expression. The craftsman wizards are supporting you. Brendel smiled and said, Sir Knight, if you speak any louder and Sir Cooper hears you, he might start to suspect your identities. Roger's expression changed, and he thought that it was more important for him to hide his identity as an internal knight, so he carefully closed his mouth. Chapter 9:30. We'll split into 3 groups. Rogers, you and Earl Jean will seize the west gate of Greystone Town and ensure that we have a way out. I'll let the Shire go with you to deal with the high-level creatures in Georgandy Ridge's army. Brando looked at the 4 knights of the internal court and deliberately emphasized the words, Earl Jean. In fact, everyone present understood that Brando was handing over the command of Earl Jean's private army to the 4 internal court knights. As for the so-called going with Earl Jean, it was just a fig leaf to avoid embarrassing the Earl. Earl Jean could only let out a low snort not far away to vent his dissatisfaction. He had no choice but to lower his head when he was under someone else's roof. Moreover, to be honest, this arrangement was quite to his liking. At least, it was much better than having his army stolen by the other party. Of course, in terms of attitude, he would definitely not be nice to Brando. In response to Brando's order, Rogers nodded silently. He knew that the young Archmage was not only here to help them, but also to monitor them. The Earl would not be completely at ease leaving the army to cruise his people. Brendel saw that Rogers had no objections and nodded in satisfaction. He trusted the Queen's inner court knights. Rogers was an upright person and did not have the bad habits of a noble. He continued, Medisa. But suddenly he saw the merchant girl jumping and waving at him with all her might. He could not help but sigh, all right, Romaine, I'll leave the diplomatic group to you. There's a bakery in Greystone Town called Rove's Compass. There's a secret passage there that leads to the lower reaches of the Silver Stream Valley. He looked at Rogers. That bakery was actually the secret base of the inner court knights in Greystone Town. This information was also given to him by the latter. Rogers nodded in confirmation. Brendel turned back. Miss Nasha will bring you and the diplomatic group to find that place. Medisa will also lead a squadron of White Lion infantry to protect you. Also, I'm leaving everyone's safety to you, so this time you have to at least act more seriously. Romaine nodded in confirmation. Brendel turned back. Miss Nasha will bring you and the diplomatic group to find that place. Medisa will also lead a squadron of White Lion infantry to protect you. The merchant girl's eyes sparkled as she nodded vigorously. Brando was still not at ease seeing him like this. He simply said to the Duke's daughter, Miss Eugenie, I'll have to trouble you. The Duke's daughter turned her head away, not wanting to see him at all. She said coldly, I'll naturally be responsible for my own safety. Then she added, besides, I think the Roman lady is much more reliable than you. At least she won't start a war for no reason. That's because you still don't have enough contact with her. Brando criticized in his heart, thinking that the young lady would soon regret her words. However, the diplomatic group would not encounter too much trouble on this route, so he dared to leave it in the hands of the Roman. Even if there was a battle, among the people accompanying them were Eek and the sergeant from Yanalasu. In addition, among the captives of the cruise, there were also the knights of the Summer Solstice Knight Regiment. Among them, there was even the vice-commander, Blofeld, who was at the peak of the gold level. In addition to Medisha, their safety was still guaranteed. The order he gave to the diplomatic group was to guard the entrance of the secret passage. If there was an unpredictable situation on the other routes, then they could at least retreat through the secret passage. This was the worst-case scenario, and it could be considered as leaving a backup plan for the whole plan. As for the last route, Brando glanced at Sir Cooper, who was not far away. Cooper still did not know what was happening in the sky at this moment. The attack of the gargoyles was carried out in complete secrecy. On the side of Cruz, only the 4 internal knights knew about it, so the knight was still dejected at this moment, with a hopeless look on his face. Sir Cooper, he asked, would you like to come with me to deal with Count Alcorn and the other imperial nobles? Cooper was slightly startled, then slowly raised his head to look at him. His expression was as if he was looking at a psychopath. Why, Sir Cooper, if I remember correctly, you should be the retainer of the Count. Is your loyalty to the Count only limited to this? Brando asked again. Cooper licked his dry lips and replied, with all due respect, Count Tonagel. He stammered a little and replied, your plan sounds perfect, but the problem is, you don't seem to have said how we should enter the city. Should we fly in? Fly in? Brando smiled and shook his head, that would be too slow. He snapped his fingers lightly. In an instant, a dozen light doors opened in front of everyone. Cooper was almost stunned by the scene in front of him, and Rogers even whispered, the Bugha's teleportation circle. He looked at Brando with a complicated expression, Count, the craftsman mages are indeed supporting you. Brando put his index finger to his lips and smiled, Mr. Knight, you know so much. If Sir Cooper hears you a little louder, he might start to suspect your identity. Rogers' expression changed, and he thought that hiding his identity as an internal knight was more important for him, so he cautiously shut his mouth. Cooper seemed to finally recognize these things. He had been fortunate enough to see the door of flame of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Although these portals were not as spectacular as the opening of the door of flame, the aura that represented space and time was the same. He stammered and asked, My lord, this is a portal. Correct answer, but no bonus points. Brando replied with a chuckle. A white light flashed in the portal, and Brando and Maynard appeared in the secluded courtyard one after another. The teleportation circle continued to flash behind the two of them, and Cooper and his guards appeared one by one, followed by Yuta and a small group of white lion swordsmen. The tree elf druids who were quietly guarding the courtyard immediately bowed when they saw Brando. Brando nodded to them in return. At this time, the Nightsong Tiger came in from outside the courtyard with the two sisters, Falerne and Tia. When he saw Brando, he put his hand on his chest and bowed like a knight, My lord. Are you ready? Brando asked. We're ready. We've captured a group of subterranean dwellers. Just as our Lord said, their loyalty is built purely on the mentality of relying on the strong. They don't have any sense of honor. When we interrogated them, they spilled the beans. The Nightsong Tiger answered very easily. The level of the White City Vanguard card was based on the level of the Fran Knight. Now that Metasha had the strength of an elemental awakener, and they were almost at the level of a lower gold, a few subterranean dwellers were a piece of cake for them. Do any of you know Jorgendigang? Brando originally thought that he could show off the Jorgendigang language that he inherited from Sophie, but he did not expect that someone in the Nightsong Tigers group would know this obscure language. His little sense of superiority was instantly shattered, but he was more curious. In the whole of Wonde, other than the dwarves in the mountains, there was not much contact with the underground inhabitants of Jorgendigang. Due to the isolation of the beehive, the underground and the surface kingdoms were almost two separate worlds. Furthermore, the Jorgendigang language was derived from the ancient Dwarven language, which was very different from the Cruz language that originated from the Myrna language. Even scholars rarely studied this language. Dia, who was standing beside Falerne, was all smiles. She opened her mouth and said a lot of strange words to him. Brendel almost jumped out of his skin when he heard it. Isn't Dia speaking Jorgentil Gaugen? She also had a strong subterranean dweller accent, which made him think, that's right, that's the smell. He almost couldn't resist the urge to ask the little girl if her family knew that Xiao could speak Genjis so well. However, when he looked at the stern-faced Falerne beside him, he couldn't bring himself to ask. Most likely, they knew. Secondly, he wanted to make fun of Dia. If Falerne lost her temper later, he wouldn't be able to handle it. In the end, Brando could only ask in surprise, Tia, when did you learn Jorgendigang language? Tajiv taught me, the wild elf answered proudly, isn't that awesome, brother Brando? Very good. Brendel was not stingy with his praise, causing the latter to chuckle. After chatting for a while, Brando asked the Nightsong Tiger, "What did they say?" "I've told you everything I can. As you've guessed, the Lord of the Shader Dwellers is Tamu. He lives in the north of here. These blind people don't know the way, so I've deduced from their descriptions. There are some other places to refer to. The street is very wide, and there's a square with a fountain in the middle. Tamu is stationed there." The Nightsong Tiger pondered for a moment, as if he was organizing his words, then answered cautiously. Brando looked at Cooper, who had yet to recover from the teleportation. It was not until Brando patted him on the shoulder that the Nightsong Tiger asked, "What's wrong?" The Nightsong Tiger had no choice but to repeat it again. This time, Cooper finally understood. "I know that place. It's called St. Shonda's Square. There's an inn called the Silver Bell there. I once stopped there when I passed by Greystone Town. It seems that it's the central area of the city." Brando said, "Our subterranean dwellers are quite good at picking places." Cooper was a little surprised. "Isn't this your first time in the Empire, Count?" Brando smiled. "The central area of the city is surrounded by the most prosperous areas of the city. Why would my lord stay in a secluded alley?" Cooper was enlightened. "Since you know that place, I'll have to trouble you to lead the way." Brando looked at the dark sky and reminded the Nightsong Tiger. The harpies would change shifts every hour or two, which meant that the residents of Georgandy Ridge would sooner or later discover that they were under attack. Although there was still plenty of time, it was not the time for idle chatter. Cooper was a little hesitant. He looked left and right and found that other than the druids in the courtyard, Brando's entourage was only the small group behind him and the Nightsong Tiger. Although he thought that Tia and Falerne were at most maids and there might be a few more outside the door, it was still a little too little. He could not help but show a bitter expression. "With all due respect, Count Brando, isn't it a little too rash for us to ambush the Lord of Georgandy Ridge with just a few people? Is it still a surprise attack when there are so many of us?" The Nightsong Tiger replied with some disdain. Brando was not surprised by the nature of these nobles. He comforted the Nightsong Tiger. "Sir, do you think I'll bring you along with me to die?" Cooper thought for a while and felt that it was more likely that Brando would send him to his death, and there was no reason for him to die with him. He also remembered that the Count of Erewhon had a good reputation. Before this, he had personally asked his comrades who were captured by Brando. Although all of them, including Count Jean, wished that the country bumpkin from Erewhon would meet with misfortune, they did not deny that Brando treated them well. At least in this aspect, he still had the demeanor of a noble. Thinking of this, Sir Cooper felt that he had grasped onto a life-saving straw, or rather, a calming pill. He hesitantly nodded to Brando. Although St. Shonda's Square was located in the most prosperous area in the center of Greystone Town, it did not refer to the geometrical center of the town. After 2 or 3 expansions, the town had long exceeded the boundaries of the city walls. In the hinterland of the empire where the fires of war had not been burned all year round, such a situation was very common. St. Shonda's Square was located in the heart of the old town. The 5 main streets that led to the 5 gates of Greystone Town converged here, forming a large open-air square. Surrounding the square were shops, hostels, local chambers of commerce, and a series of tall buildings. Of course, the most majestic building under the night sky was the temple of the god of pottery, Kalidos. However, the god of pottery was extremely unlucky. Last time in Bucci, the undead of Madara only managed to destroy one wall of his temple. Now, this group of subterranean dwellers had directly used the temple as an army camp. Brando and his entourage hid behind a wall next to a nearby shop. When the Nightsong Tiger saw this scene, he could not help but twitch his mouth and said, "Although these subterranean dwellers are blind, they can still differentiate between good and bad. They actually used the temple as a place for them to eat, drink, and defecate. Although this was the era of mortals, and the gods had left Wone for thousands of years, and the dark dragon and the four sages had established a new order on the earth, the people of Martha had never forgotten the gods' favor in the ancient times. Many people still believed that the gods would one day return to Wone. The monks of the Holy Cathedral of Fire were devout believers of Martha, and did not intend to stop this saying. Moreover, the divine spells of the priests had never failed, which proved that the protectors of order were still responding to the call of their people. This saying was very popular in the countryside, especially in the south of Cruz and Erewhon. Poor Sir Cooper was such a devout believer, and when he heard the Nightsong Tiger's blasphemous words, his face turned pale. However, he did not dare to say that the Nightsong Tiger was wrong, because even in his opinion, these damned subterranean dwellers had gone too far. There was a fountain in the middle of St. Chanda Square, and the statue in the fountain was said to be a full-body portrait of the local founder, Mr. Chanda. Unfortunately, the statue had fallen from its pedestal and was smashed into pieces. There were 2 razor boars next to the statue, drinking from the fountain. Not far from them, their tamers, more than 10 purple-colored, long-maned subterranean dwellers, were either standing or sitting on the marble steps of the Holy Cathedral. They were communicating in a language that most of the people present did not understand. How vulgar! Even Brando could not help but shake his head. The subterranean dwellers were not civilized, and they only believed in the mysterious spirits of the dark caves. It was unrealistic to expect them to maintain basic respect for Cruz's history and culture. He pointed to the rooftops of the nearby buildings and said, "Tia, Falerne, you two take care of these noisy things." He was referring to the harpies on the rooftops. There were a total of 7 harpies monitoring the entire square from the top of the Chamber of Commerce and the Noble Assembly. They were especially alert in the dark, constantly leaping up and down, attacking each other and making shrill noises. It was very annoying. "No problem," Falerne replied, and Tia nodded firmly. Brando then pointed to the subterranean dwellers at the entrance of the Holy Cathedral and said, "Yuta, I'll leave these to you. There's a total of 18 rats. Don't let them make a sound." The White Lion Guards that accompanied the diplomatic party were basically the best of the best. The 10 chosen for this raid were the best of the best, and each of them was at least a mid-silver. They could even put up a fight against a razor boar. Brando was not worried at all that they could not deal with a group of subterranean dwellers. Yuta hesitated for a moment. She brushed her flame-like hair away from her forehead, but she still nodded. "There are 2 razor boars left. I'll take care of one and leave the other to your guard captain. These things don't have much intelligence. Just don't let them make too much noise," Brando said as he looked at Cooper's guard captain, Mr. Walton. "What do you think?" Walton, a swordsman who made his name in Ludwig, had a pair of thick eyebrows. He looked at Brando suspiciously, as if he was doubting the strength of this young man. But in the end, he still nodded. "Maynard, stay here with the druids to deal with any unexpected situations," Brando said. "Yes," the knight replied calmly. Chapter 931. Stars twinkled in the night sky. Brando stared at the ceiling of the Chamber of Commerce and the Chamber of Commerce for several minutes. He waited for the harpies to land for the 3rd time before he finally gave the order, "Let's do it." Light flashed between Falerne's fingers, and 4 harpies 100 meters away from her were pierced by dark blue arrows. The arrows pierced through their hearts, and they immediately turned into ice sculptures with a cracking sound. Battle wizards could draw spells from the Circle of Curses, and their casting speed was extremely fast. However, elven messengers were slower by half a beat. Tia's reaction was even slower. She tried her best to finish reciting every single word of the spell. She pushed her hands forward, and everyone saw an invisible ripple sweep across the sky above the plaza. It swept across the bodies of the fleeing harpies. In an instant, they were torn to pieces, turning into a rain of blood that fell from the sky. Tia didn't expect her spell to have such a great effect. She couldn't help but stick her tongue out at Brando apologetically. "Against Stormblade," Brando muttered to himself, "is it really necessary to use a Circle 7 spell against 3 harpies?" At this time, the subterranean dwellers in the square were alarmed. Although they couldn't see, they could hear the commotion. The subterranean dwellers at the entrance of the Holy Temple panicked and grabbed their weapons. Suddenly, a wave of crossbow bolts flew out from the darkness, and the pitiful creatures fell to the ground as if they had hit an invisible wall. The remaining 3 or 4 subterranean dwellers didn't even have time to react before the White Lion guards pierced through their hearts with swords. The next unlucky ones were the patrol team. Yuta personally intercepted them. The female mercenary leader's flame-like hair was like an eye-catching flag in the dark night. It danced up and down with her movements, and the crimson fire raven's tongue shone brightly. When Brando saw the sword, he was stunned for a moment. Only then did he remember that he had given the sword to the mercenary leader. The fire raven's tongue seemed to have been given life in Yuta's hands. She raised her hand and turned the sword into a flaming whip. The golden-red whip swept across a distance of 34 meters, wrapping around 4 or 5 fleeing subterranean dwellers and turning them into ashes. The rest of the subterranean dwellers were unable to resist the White Lion guards. One by one, they fell to the ground and were slaughtered. Cooper looked at the sword in Yuta's hand and then looked at the beautiful figure of the female mercenary leader. He couldn't help but look back at Brando enviously, thinking that the young man was really lucky. At this moment, there were only 2 razorboars left in the square. These beasts that came from the underworld were extremely huge, almost as big as a cow. They had 4 pairs of fangs that were arranged side by side. Each pair was more than half a meter long, just like a sharp, snow-white scimitar. That was how the name razorboars came about. After the Chadre cavemen domesticated them, they put on metal masks and eye masks, further reducing their weaknesses. Hence, they became the beasts that lived up to their name. These creatures had a violent temperament and were famous killers in the underworld. However, their brains seemed to be burned by the constant anger, and their intelligence was extremely low. Wild razorboars attacked all enemies that entered their territory, and sometimes even their mates. Even after they were domesticated, their only target was their tamer. When all the subterranean dwellers in the square were killed, the 2 razorboars came to their senses. Naturally, their first choice was not to howl loudly to call for their companions. Instead, they immediately buried their heads and charged at the humans who appeared in their sight. Walton and Brando stood in front of the 2 razorboars, one on the left and the other on the right. Walton had been famous in Ludwig for a long time. Other than his swordsmanship, his strength was also at the peak of the gold tier. However, he didn't dare to be too careless in the face of these crazy boars. When the razorboar charged at him, he dodged to the side and used crews to slash at the big guy's hooves. The razorboar's hooves were cut off, and its head slammed into the ground. It opened its mouth and wanted to scream, but before the sharp air could rush out of its throat, Walton's sword pierced its throat and sealed it in its stomach. The tragic sound of the slaughtered boar eventually turned into the sound of the air hitting the broken trachea, and dirty blood gushed out. Walton looked at the dead razorboar lying on the ground and couldn't help but nod in satisfaction. He was obviously very satisfied with the way he handled the situation. To be able to end the battle so cleanly, it meant that his understanding of swordsmanship had improved by another step. However, he was a little surprised that the young count hadn't made a move yet. Logically speaking, no matter who won or lost, there should be some movement. Even if Walton handled the situation so cleanly, the razorboar still made a loud noise when it hit the ground. Of course, Walton didn't think that Brando could be stronger than him. He had followed Cooper for a long time, and although he hadn't heard much about the Count's strength, he had heard about his impulsiveness and arrogance. When Brando attacked the Black Sword Fortress, the Empire only said that the Count had a genuine archmage by his side. Walton didn't believe that Brando was a swordsman in his early 20s. But when he turned around, he saw a scene that left him dumbfounded. Brando stood still, and not far away, the razor boar was lying on the ground, trembling like a sieve. It was so scared that it wet its pants, and it didn't dare to take half a step forward. All the young men of the White Lion Guards, including the female mercenary leader, looked at their lord with reverence. Walton wasn't ignorant, and he naturally understood what had happened. The might of a swordsman. In the natural world, only a few creatures that had reached a certain level of power could naturally produce pressure, such as dragons or mythical creatures that couldn't be described with words outside the elemental frontier. However, for the Iron Folk, only those who had reached a certain level of strength in a domain and had even grasped the principles of the laws could produce pressure, the power of the laws, the power of the Sword Saint. In order to reach this level, the only condition that had to be fulfilled was the enlightenment of truth. Brando did indeed feel the existence of the laws of nature at that moment, and even he didn't know what had happened. The moment he pulled out his sword and pointed it at the razor boar, a mysterious knowledge responded from the Halran Gaia. At that moment, he seemed to understand the meaning of mountains and rivers, and the meaning of eternity. But this was just a story that happened in an instant. It was as if he had truly stepped into the realm of the elemental enlightenment for a moment, but in an instant, he had returned to the peak state of elemental activation. But in just a moment of the elemental enlightenment, the pressure naturally exuded from his body was enough to frighten the razor boar, which lacked intelligence. Brando had a faint premonition in his heart. He withdrew his sword, looked at the razor boar lying on the ground, and said to the others, "Don't worry about this thing, it won't be able to react for a while. Quickly attack the temple." As he said this, he raised his head and silently glanced at the dark night sky. Unknowingly, dark clouds had covered the starlight. Perhaps it was because of the blessing of the god of pottery, Kalados, or some other reason, the battle to enter the temple was very smooth. The troglodytes stationed in the temple didn't expect the changes outside at all. When the White Lion Guards attacked the temple, they were caught off guard and lost the initiative. The rest of the battle was almost a one-sided massacre. Although Tanu's bugbear guards launched a fearless counterattack, these Grade 4 creatures from the underground of Jorgendi Ridge were obviously better at fighting in caves than on the surface. Under the attack of Yuta, Maynard, and Walton, the White Lion Guards almost wiped out Tanu's guards at the cost of one minor injury. The battle ended faster than expected. Tampu was the lord of the Shadra subterranean dwellers. But that was it. The subterranean dwellers were the lowest existence in Jorgendi Ridge, and their status was only slightly higher than that of the ground dragon. Tampu was most famous in the underworld for having a minotaur as a slave. With this Tier 6 creature, he occupied a small territory at the edge of the Tranquil Lands and built up his prestige among his fellow subterranean dwellers. He raised an army and became the lord of the Tranquil Lands, but his power was only slightly stronger than the banished Tajiv. This time, the Minotaur he had always relied on was only able to withstand a few blows from Walton before its head was chopped off. The stench of blood spurted out from the Minotaur, who was hiding behind the Minotaur, and it almost fainted. When Janna dragged him out of the holy temple, the lord had lost all of his former majesty. Instead, he was like a rooster that had fallen into water, shivering in fear. "My lord, this guy doesn't know much, but he has told us everything he can," Yuta said. "Why don't you ask him again?" Brando glanced at Tanu, but shook his head and replied anxiously, "Don't waste my time. Just tell me what he said." Yuta was slightly startled and looked at Brando strangely. Maynard, who had followed them out, did not have as many concerns as the mercenary commander. She also noticed something unusual in Brando's tone and asked, "What happened?" Brendel shook his head gently. He vaguely felt that the sword from before was a little unusual. The feeling that came from the ground was definitely not his own understanding of the laws, but some kind of connection. He just happened to feel this connection at the right time. He remembered the legend of Jorgendi Ridge. Before the Great Schism, the people of the underworld did indeed believe in the same god as the Lion Men of Toquinin. This legend made him feel a little uneasy, as if it was connected with some of the doubts he had in the past few days. However, he could not find the key point for the time being. There was another thing that puzzled him. That feeling was clearly coming from the sky, but the sky was not the traditional territory of the Jorgendi Ridge. This made Brendel unable to tell what he felt for a while. Jutta looked at the female knight, and then at her liege. She did not dare to let the latter wait for too long. She whispered, "I'm afraid even this guy doesn't know how big the invasion of Jorgendi Ridge is this time. But my liege, according to his description, I'm afraid it's not small." This was within Brendel's expectations, and Janna's words only confirmed his conjecture. Brendel threw away the messy thoughts in his mind and cleared his mind. He asked, "How many units of Jorgendi Ridge's army are stationed in Greystone Town? Who is the main force of Jorgendi Ridge's army in this direction? It should know, right? There are only 2 troops of Jorgendi Ridge stationed in Greystone Town. The other liege is called Guku, Brother Brando." Tia answered first. Jutta nodded as if she was testifying, indicating that Tanu's words were translated by Tia. Guku. Brando felt that he had heard this name before. But when he thought about it, he realized that this name did not seem to belong to any well-known liege in Jorgendi Ridge. It was not even as famous as Tanu. Tanu was one of the only 2 liege lords of the Shadre cavemen. In addition to his Minotaur slaves, he was somewhat famous in this regard. What made him feel strange was that, theoretically speaking, a lord that he had heard of would definitely not be unknown. Brando could not help but wonder if his memory was wrong. He turned back to Maynard for help, but he found that the female knight was also frowning as if she was thinking about the same problem as him. "What about the other problem?" he asked again. "The liege who is now marching toward Asaf seems to be a guy called Moksha, but this guy can't explain it clearly. He's really useless." Tia glanced at Tanu and replied, "Moksha." Brando was slightly startled. "So it's him, the king of the lizard men. He is considered a lord second only to Geralt and Medusa. If he is the commander of Jorgendi Ridge's attack on Asaf, then the forces of Jorgendi Ridge invading the surface world this time will not be too small. At least there must be a real king of the underground in the south." The wild elf sister smiled and replied, "Brother Brando, you guessed right. The Jorgendi Ridge army that is attacking Rokizi, the Broken Sword Mountain Fortress group, is the army from the Venom Swamp. The Medusa Queen." Brando immediately reacted, but he was not too nervous. After all, it was the Empire that was in trouble now, and it had nothing to do with him. No matter how powerful the Medusa Queen was, it was impossible for her to turn north from Rokizi Plateau to cause trouble for him. He asked a few more questions, and Tia answered them one by one. But as Jutta said, Tanu knew very little. He did not even know the real reason why Jorgendi Ridge invaded the surface world. As for why he appeared here, it was because he was forced to participate in the war by a more powerful lord. This was a common occurrence in the Underdark, and Brando was not surprised. In the end, Brando asked about the whereabouts of Count Alcorn and his men. These unlucky imperial nobles were locked in the underground tomb of the Holy Cathedral by Tanu. At this moment, Sir Cooper had led his men to rescue them. But it was conceivable that the cavemen did not have the superfluous bearing of nobles. It was almost imaginable what would happen to Count Alcorn and his men if they fell into their hands. Even if they did not die, they would probably lose a layer of skin. Speaking of this matter, Brando could not help but think maliciously that if the Count had known about this earlier, he might have taken the initiative to surrender to him and would rather be a captive of Erwin's men. At the same time, Tia's description of the Cruz nobles' encounter also confirmed another premonition in Brando's heart. The fact that the Shadr cavemen did not value these Cruz captives meant that they were not targeting Count Alcorn at all. In other words, the Count was captured by these cavemen on the way. However, Brando did not have time to sigh for the unlucky Count at this moment. He immediately looked at Maynard and asked, "Did you find that thing?" Maynard nodded. Then, she took out an item. The item in her palm was not even the size of her palm. It was a bit like an enlarged platinum coin. This kind of gold coin was widely used in the fanzine area. Because of the special casting process, its surface was brighter than ordinary gold coins. However, the metal disc in the female knight's hand was even brighter than ordinary platinum coins. It was like a sparkling gemstone with metallic characteristics, but there was no obvious crystallization structure. And if one looked closely, one would even find that this metal disc contained a faint glow of flames. Anyone could tell at a glance that this metal disc was not an ordinary item because all the metals and forging techniques in the mortal world could not create the same thing. Even if it was similar, it seemed unlikely. Janna's attention was drawn to the metal disc the moment she saw it. She stared at it as if she was possessed. It took her a long time to react. "What is this?" "It's so beautiful," she blurted out. Brando heard this sentence and could not help but smile bitterly. Such an item, in Yutta's eyes, was only beautiful, but for anyone who had ever seen it, it was the most precious treasure in the world. Wand had two things that mortals could not touch. The first was fate, and the second was the law. But Martha finally gave mortals the power to change everything. The master of fate lies in the amber key, and all the whispers between heaven and earth are recorded on the stone tablet. Pale Poem, Verse 4, Paragraph 3, P.S. Silly Miss also, I beg for monthly votes. Everyone, seeing that I'm working so hard today, I hope you won't be stingy with your votes. Chapter 933. Looking down from the sky, the entire city was immersed in darkness. In the North City, there were still shadows of subterranean dwellers moving around, but the center of the old city was dead silent. Looking further south, there was a group of people moving quickly along the streets without any lights. Faster! Don't give them a chance to react. Medusa took the lead. She was like a silver flame that swept across the street. The patrolling subterranean dwellers that were blocking the road immediately fled in all directions. Those who were unable to dodge in time were engulfed by the soul flame of the silver elf princess spear and burned to ashes. The elegant and tall unicorn galloped on the street. Its four hooves that were covered in soul flame flashed and disappeared in a flash, leaving behind only a trail of light behind it. Behind her was the White Lion Knight Squad in a charging formation, followed by the Summer Solstice Knight Squad. Follow them, Knight of the Empire. The Summer Solstice Knight Squad's vice-captain, Bloomfield, also roared, "Go and open a path for our allies, protect the left and right wings, don't let those underground rats have a chance to take advantage of us." The crew's knights had already taken back their equipment 2 days ago. Brando invited them to fight for the Empire, and as the Empire's knight, they naturally couldn't refuse. Although they knew that they were still hostages, the Georgiandy gang was the enemy of the Empire. In comparison, Erewhon's people and Cruz's people had an advantage. As the saying goes, there is only a gap when there is a comparison. After the Knight Squad cleared the path, it was the bloated team of envoys. In this team, except for a few nobles who were born in the military who could keep up with the speed of the envoys, the rest of the people who lived like princes were pushed, dragged, or carried by their servants. There were a few who were especially fat with their tongues hanging out, and they looked like dying old dogs from afar. But at this time, no one dared to complain, and no one urged them to move forward, but the consequences of falling behind were self-evident. Erewhon's envoys rode on horses, and these were all real war horses. Firstly, Brando didn't want to waste Medusha's night preparation card on these nobles, and secondly, summoning the heroic spirit Pegasus would cause too much of a commotion, and it would be hard to not attract attention. But after all, the number of mounts was limited. At this moment, there were only 3 people on the Roman horse. She was hugging the daughter of the Duke of Grenoires, and Chiara was behind her. Fortunately, the weight of the three added together was not as big as the meatball that was Ephraim, and these pure-blooded cruise horses could carry them easily. "Ephraim, you idiot, you went the wrong way, come back. Don't hold the reins so tightly. Do you know how to ride a horse?" "There are monsters on the left, Mr. Bloomfield, please stop those subterranean dwellers." "Ah!" Romaine screamed in fright and quickly lowered her small body to protect the daughter. At the same time, she dodged the spear thrown by the subterranean dwellers and asked loudly, "Chiara, are you all right?" "I'm fine, Miss Roman." The representative of House Cypher, the eldest son's sister, was so scared that her face turned pale. The spear almost flew past her nose, but she let out a soft sigh and calmed down immediately. There was only excitement left in her light blue eyes. "Miss Roman, there's a subterranean dweller over there. Quick, let's go take a look." The book said that when these monsters are alive, their skin can change color according to the environment, just like a chameleon, but I've never seen one before. "Okay." Roman replied with great interest when he heard this. "No." The only normal person among the three, the daughter of Grimoires, Judith, was so scared that she cried out, "Sister Roman, Sister Chiara, let's run, woo-woo." Romaine was in a dilemma. On one hand, Chiara's words made her curious, and on the other hand, Judith's tears made her flustered. She thought for a moment, and finally came up with a perfect answer. "Princess Magadol, Eugenie, come and help me." The Duke's daughter was sitting behind Marjorie. When she saw this scene, how could she not know that the young lady had suddenly come up with a strange idea? She snorted coldly and said, "Please conduct yourself with dignity, Miss Roman, have you forgotten the commander's words?" As for Princess Magadol, the latter smiled at her and shook her head. "Ah!" The Roman seemed to have just remembered Brando's instructions, and immediately showed a dejected expression. Chiara, on the other hand, had a displeased look on her face. "That hateful fellow. Then let's just say that he owes us 2 live subterranean dwellers, 1 for each of us. The Count's debt is quite bizarre." Eek couldn't help but say to Marjorie when he heard this. The officer from Janalesa nodded in agreement. Although the diplomatic party was noisy, Romaine had the demeanor of a leader of a merchant party. She managed to keep the bloated group in order. At least under her reminder, no one was left behind, and there were no accidents. Of course, the only thing that troubled the vice-commander of the Shia Solstice Night Regiment, Bloomfield, was that the young lady's orders would be better. She wouldn't mix in the slang of merchants in 2 or 3 sentences. How could a knight like him understand such things? The group moved forward, getting closer and closer to their destination. Finally, after turning the last corner, the conspicuous sign of Romaine's compass with 4 arrows appeared in everyone's eyes. "We're here." The knight Nasha couldn't help but cheer. Medisha immediately raised her left hand and stopped everyone. "Squads 1 to 8, spread out and find cover. Commander Bloomfield, get your men to find cover. Miss Roman, get the diplomatic party to hide in the house." "What's wrong?" Nasha was slightly taken aback and looked at the fairy princess in confusion. She didn't understand the meaning of her order. Bloomfield also looked over with a puzzled expression. Only the Roman looked at Medisha and immediately ordered the nobles behind her. "Quick, quick, hide in the house." In fact, the nobles at the back hadn't turned the corner and didn't know what was happening in front of them. But they were already used to the strange orders of the merchant lady. No matter how ridiculous these orders sounded, they were always useful. For example, she ordered the party to stop for no reason and avoid the ambush of the subterranean dwellers. Or she said that they were going to the left to go to the right to avoid the subterranean dwellers. It was as if there was a halo of miraculous luck that enveloped this young lady. They were already used to it. Now that the Roman gave the order, the nobles rushed into the buildings on both sides as if it was a conditioned reflex. They were so uniform that it was as if they had been rehearsed many times. It was shocking. Fortunately, the owners of these houses had fled Greystone Town before the war, so there weren't any unnecessary disputes. Bloomfield saw this scene and felt a little apprehensive. But the commander of the Solstice Knights also expressed his admiration for the Roman lady's halo. Even though he was skeptical, he still ordered his subordinates to find cover. Everyone hid in the shadows on both sides of the street. Moments later, Medisha suddenly looked up at the night sky. Following her gaze, Bloomfield and Nasha also looked up. The nobles hiding in the houses also looked up at the narrow sky above the street. Anslova's clear night sky was filled with twinkling stars. A few sparse clouds floated in the distance. The proud moon gradually disappeared into the clouds, casting a shadow on the ground. The surroundings seemed to have become unusually quiet. What is that sound? Internal Court Knight Nasha suddenly asked uneasily, did I hear wrong? Bloomfield, the vice-commander of the Solstice Knights, shook his head. He also heard it. The sound of the wind below the clouds. In Anzaruta's winter, there was a land and sea breeze that blew from the floating cloud hill to the supreme inland sea. When the wind swept through the pine forest in the vast wilderness of Anslova, it would make the sound of pines rustling. This sound echoed in the silent night like a poem and a song. But at this moment, this long poem between heaven and earth seemed to be recited by another voice. This voice gradually became louder and louder, as if a lunatic with a red face was shouting at the top of his lungs. The sound of the wind gradually became a roar as it swept across the entire hill. The nobles and knights who were hiding on both sides of the street were dumbfounded as they watched the airflow in the night sky become visible to the naked eye in an instant. Along with the sharp whistling sound, there were sounds of things being thrown to the ground and broken into pieces. When these sounds gathered together, it was like the omen before the end of the world. It was bewitching. In an instant, Medisha narrowed her eyes. Everyone who raised their heads to look at the sky like her saw a huge shadow pass through the clouds like a fish. It swept across the sky above Greystone Town, and what followed was an unparalleled power that pressed down from the sky. Clang! The metal disc in Maynard's hand that shimmered under the moonlight, a treasure whose value could not be estimated with the eyes of mortals, suddenly fell from her hand and landed on the ground. Brando looked at the female knight strangely. With Maynard's strength, it was impossible for her to not be able to hold something steady. Moreover, he knew very well how much she understood the value of this metal disc. There was no way she would be careless and lose it. Maynard frowned and looked at the disc on the ground. She did not bend down to pick it up. Instead, she looked at the metal disc with a puzzled expression. It was trembling slightly on the marble steps, making a buzzing sound as if an invisible hand was controlling it to dance. 5 pairs of eyes met on the metal disc, but after a while, they looked up again. Brando was the first to see the clouds moving faster under the night sky. Damn! Why is there such a thing? Quick, hide in the holy temple. His expression changed. He pulled Tia up and rushed back into the holy temple. The wild elf was caught off guard and screamed in fear. Maynard's reaction was a little slower, but she bent down to pick up the metal disc and followed behind. Yuta was right behind her. Although she did not understand what was going on, she saw the strange phenomenon in the sky above Anklova and realized that something was wrong. She subconsciously followed Brando's footsteps. Falerne was the last to arrive. She picked up her younger sister's staff and walked into the temple unhurriedly. She handed the staff to her younger sister, who was still in a state of shock, and rolled her eyes at her liege. Unfortunately, Brando did not notice her gaze. He and Maynard were looking at the sky outside the holy temple nervously. The clouds were moving westward. The howling wind seemed to have suppressed all sounds, and the whole world seemed to have turned into another sense of silence. Silently, a black shadow swept across the clouds. Its open wings covered the light of the moon and stars, casting a dim shadow over Greystone Town. Jana and Tia's eyes widened at the same time. They didn't even know when their mouths had dropped open. Right after the first black shadow, a second black shadow appeared. The two black shadows, one in front and one behind, slowly traversed half the night sky. Yuta could hear her throat gurgling. Her heart felt like it was going to jump out of her chest. For a moment, she could feel her blood rushing in reverse. It was as if every strand of her hair was standing on end. Tia also grabbed her brother's hand tightly. She did not even realize it herself. She stared at the sky, her emerald green eyes sparkling. There was a legend in Woned. It said that if someone saw the shadow of a dragon under the clouds, then it meant that not long after, a child with the dragon's favor would be born. That was the origin of the bloodline talent, the shadow of the dragon. However, since the Golden Age passed, there were very few people who saw a real dragon on the earth. A full-grown dragon. This was not a dragon like Alaz, Forel, or Sheeta who came out to train. It was a real dragon, the most terrifying and elegant creature of this era. A real full-grown dragon. When they spread their wings, it was like a floating shadow. It was as if they could block the light of the sun, the moon, the stars, and everything else. When they soared in the clouds, they were like fish swimming in the sky. The sky was their ocean. They were the masters of the sky. Dragon. It took the female mercenary leader a while to utter the word. It's a black dragon. Maynard added. I know these two dragons. Brando said. His face was gloomy. Modesty and Malthus. Who are they, Brother Brando? Tia asked, still a little scared. Sinful dragons, the banished black dragons. They are one of the 5 lords of Georgandy Ridge. They are here too. The ashes at Bear Lake. Maynard suddenly remembered and reminded him in a low voice. It's the Ridge Drake. Brando shook his head. It's a pity that I've never seen this top creature of Georgandy Ridge. Otherwise, I would have recognized it. They are here for this thing. Yuta asked as she stared at the metal disc in Maynard's hand. Her face was still a little pale, as if she could not breathe properly. The deterrence from the dragon was almost tangible. If she was not beside Brando just now, she would have screamed in fear. But after calming down a little, she immediately thought of the thing that they just got from Tonpu. Brando shook his head. I'm afraid not. This is probably a coincidence. That thing, he looked at Maynard and saw the same meaning in her eyes. He changed his words. Tonpu should have thought of it on the spur of the moment. No. He shook his head again. Its level is not high enough. It should be the idea of the Lizard King. But they have not realized the value of this thing. Otherwise, they would not have kept it so casually and let us get it. He took a deep breath and said, but you are right, Yuta. They will not come to the surface world easily. These two big guys must be up to something. My lord. Brando smiled bitterly. Fortunately, he was vigilant before and threw the Halran Gaia into Amon's dimensional cave. Now he could finally confirm where the inexplicable connection came from. At the same time, he probably understood one thing. The real purpose of Georgandy Ridge. The shadow of the dragon was moving away. Medisha sighed softly. Behind her, almost all the nobles of Cruz were paralyzed on the ground. Chiara's face was pale and she was out of breath. There were even people who screamed. Fortunately, the merchant lady was quick to cast a silent spell and saved the diplomatic group. But the most miserable of all were Avram and the Duke's daughter, Judith. They fainted and lost consciousness. What? What is that? Eugenie could almost hear the sound of his teeth chattering. Dragon. It's a dragon. Chiara took small breaths. Her light blue eyes seemed to be gradually regaining their luster. She was scared to death, but she was also excited to death. That's a real dragon. Shut up. Medisha ordered sternly. Don't make a sound. The silver elf princess's stern expression even scared the Roman. The latter had never seen her like this. Medisha sighed and whispered, if you don't want to die, don't talk. You don't know how terrible a real dragon is. In any case, her words had the right effect. The summer night and the soldiers of the White Lion Guards who could still speak also obediently shut their mouths. But just as the silence spread, an abrupt voice suddenly rang out in the silent night, don't lose it. The voice came from afar, followed by a second exasperated shout. Damn it, close your eyes. P.S. Did you see enough yesterday? If you still want more, buy more tickets. Chapter 934. The twinkling tree was a precious tree in the south of St. Tassol. Its seed was rich in light element magic, and after being processed by a special method, as long as it was shaken, it would burst out a dazzling light like the sun, temporarily blinding people. The young man called F behind Delphi and watched as the little elf threw the round object at him. He quickly closed his eyes and screamed to the others, quickly close your eyes. The twinkling tree seed drew a beautiful arc and fell at the feet of the Prime Minister's daughter, rolling forward. The others didn't have time to react, and their eyes were still fixed on the round object. They saw it hit the wall and stopped. A crack appeared in the wall, and a pure white light shot out from it. It was at this time that a figure flashed in the corridor. A woman's slender hand reached out to the twinkling tree seed and grabbed it in the palm of her hand. This hand seemed to have some kind of invisible magic that could bind the surging light together. The bursting light seemed to have hit an invisible barrier and was reflected back. The dazzling light flashed slightly, and then became gentle. All the light seemed to have gathered into a warm ball of light, and was firmly controlled by this hand within a very small range. Everyone stared at the scene with their mouths agape. F was the only one who closed his eyes. He didn't hear any sound for a long time, so he couldn't help but open half of his eyes. He saw this strange scene, a woman with silver hair, wearing a white robe, and holding a ball of light in her hand, was standing in the middle of the corridor. The ball of light floated in the air, and the light above reflected the cold expression on this woman's face. She was very tall, even taller than many human males. Her pair of eyes seemed to be made of pure silver, shining brightly. The light of the ball of light was slowly dissipating in her hand. Before returning to darkness, this woman turned her head and fiercely glared at the little elf. The little elf was not afraid of anything, but this glare made her heart beat like a drum. She was full of grievances, and in the end, she pouted her little mouth with tears in her eyes. If you don't want to die, quickly leave this place. The woman in the white robe coldly looked around at everyone and opened her mouth. Her voice was somewhat hoarse and deep. Who are you? Delphian asked cautiously. May I ask what is the meaning of this? The sudden appearance of this woman shocked everyone present. To be able to restrain the blossoming light in the palm of her hand, how powerful was her control over the light element. If the previous scene was an illusion, then at this moment, the ball of light in her palm was transforming into specks of light that dissipated into the darkness. Just this ability alone was enough to make everyone present unable to resist. The white-robed woman glanced at the ceiling and shook her head anxiously. She seemed to be suppressing something as she said, "Idiots, leave quickly. I don't have time to explain it to you." Delphian still wanted to say something, but she suddenly felt as if her heart had been pricked by a needle, causing her to involuntarily take a step back. She raised her head and looked at the woman in front of her in surprise. A sense of helplessness and fear rose in everyone's hearts at that moment. The two bodyguards of the Prime Minister's daughter fell to the ground with a thump and shouted, "Madam, are you going to kill us?" But at this time, the only one who was not affected, Shienni suddenly flew up and grabbed the cloak by the back of the elf's neck and pulled her back with all her might. At the same time, she screamed, "Little elf, run! She's a dragon!" Everyone could see that the woman's eyes gradually turned into a flowing mercury-like color, and slender silver scales gradually appeared on her forehead. Dong! The wooden house seemed to have been hit by a violent gust of wind, and suddenly, the whole house shook. Outside of Rove's compass, the envoys hiding on both sides of the street could see even more clearly. A huge monster was descending from the sky, flapping its shadowy wings. Every time it flapped its wings, the wind was like a storm, sweeping across the sky above Greystone Town. The temperature rose steadily, and the turbulence formed by the air carried scattered sparks. Once the sparks landed on the roof, they would rise into a raging inferno. Everyone felt as if a distant scream rose in their hearts. This scream came from the distant darkness, piercing straight into the depths of their souls. Everyone's hearts contracted due to excessive nervousness, and blood flowed from all parts of their bodies. Their vision gradually turned pitch black from all sides to the center. They opened their mouths wide like fish out of water, and the weaker ones directly fainted. Kiera only pressed on her chest, and a flush of color surged on her pale face. She stared at this scene closely, as if afraid that she would miss a single detail. It was a huge dragon descending from the clouds. It flapped its wings and hovered above Greystone Town. Its pitch-black eyes were like a pair of dull graphite balls, looking down at the world with indifference. It coldly stared at the city, but it gave people the illusion that this pair of terrifying eyes was looking down at them from above. This huge monster was almost half the size of the town, and the flowing flames under its wings were like a cloud of fire. The turbulence carried specks of golden light, and after the fragmented light descended, the entire area was plunged into a sea of fire. The streets were burning, creaking and groaning. "Medisha, are we going to die? Medisha, Medisha, is it coming to eat us? Medisha, will Brando come to save us? Will Brando be eaten too? Forget it, the Roman doesn't need Brando to save us. Brando, run. Run as far as you can." Romaine was scared out of her wits, and Medisha bit her lower lip as she stared at this scene. Beside her, Nasha had already fainted, Yenid was hugging herself in tears, and Dilfari was hiding in the embrace of her cowgirl knight. Eek was trembling as she unsheathed her sword, and Marjorie was guarding the Duke's daughter. Out of everyone, only the nun Princess Magadal was unaffected, and even she felt that it was a little strange. The Silver Elf Princess was like a taut bowstring, ready to fight to the death at any time, but at this moment, she let out a soft gasp. Another aura was rising from Rove's compass. It was weak at first, like a candle in the wind, but it grew rapidly, and in an instant, it was able to match the aura descending from the sky. From bottom to top, it actually pushed back the aura of the black dragon that occupied the sky. "I didn't expect you to be hiding here, Mithril." In mid-air, a thunderous voice rumbled, with contempt and a hint of mockery, like a cat playing with a mouse. "Obsidian." An angry voice resounded throughout Greystone Town. The source of the voice came from Rove's compass, the small wooden house that was drifting in the wind. The wooden house seemed to be under an unimaginable pressure, and it was creaking. Its wooden walls, floor, door, and windows were all trembling, as if it would fall apart at any time. The aura of the white-robed woman was exploding uncontrollably. She looked at the others with pity, and tried her best to suppress the violent energy in her body. With difficulty, she reminded them, "Run for your lives." The last syllable of her sentence turned into a distant roar. She stretched her neck and let out a long roar. Silver wings grew out from her back, and her limbs turned into sharp claws covered with fine and solid scales. Her white robe was torn apart inch by inch, revealing the body of a dragon. A tail also grew out from between her legs. When she turned her head again, she had completely taken the form of a dragon. Under everyone's horrified gaze, this silver dragon was rapidly growing. It broke through the corridor, the roof of the wooden house, and stepped on the floor. Everyone in the corridor slid down with the collapsed floor. Delphian screamed and fell down the stairs. The little elf dizzily fell forward and hit her forehead on the door frame. Ouch! She flailed her arms and legs in an attempt to grab hold of something, and ended up grabbing hold of Sydney's tail and dragging her down, screaming. Effie, Solons, and 2 of Delphine's guards were all grasping at the nearest obstacle, but to no avail. After a sharp groan, Rove's compass was completely torn apart. Bricks and planks, dust and pillars all broke and collapsed, turning into dust and debris. In an instant, the place was turned into ruins. Above the ruins, a gigantic and elegant creature was spreading its wings. The dust and tiles on its wings fell to the ground like rain. Roman and Kiera looked up in a daze at the pair of wings that blotted out the sky as it rose higher and higher. When the silver curtain was fully spread out, it almost covered a few streets nearby. Both of their mouths were slightly agape. The silver dragon had become incomparably huge, occupying a few streets. Its silver body shone under the moonlight, and its scales seemed to be enveloped by a sacred and inviolable halo. She raised her head and looked at the black dragon in the sky with her mercury-like eyes. Obsidian, I'll ask you one more time. Why did you break your oath and leave Georgandy Ridge? The woman's cold voice echoed in the sky above Greystone Town. It even crossed the valley and spread in all directions, spreading to the nearby hills. 1 or 2 miles away, in the center of the old city, Brando witnessed everything more clearly. He saw the shadow in the sky return and descend over Greystone Town. An aura that was comparable to the shadow rose from the city. In an instant, a silver dragon appeared out of thin air a few streets away and confronted the shadow. Yuta and Tia were speechless. Sir Cooper was walking out of the temple with Earl Alcorn, who was covered in wounds. When he saw the scene, he was so scared that his legs went weak and he knelt down. "Oh, Martha, what's going on?" Cooper screamed. Brando did not know what was going on. What was going on in Greystone Town? "Medisha, answer me quickly," he shouted nervously through the spiritual link. "My lord." Medisha replied with some difficulty. "Where are you?" Brando asked nervously. "I'm here. You should have seen it. I'm right here." Medisha glanced at the scenery outside that mortals might not see once in their lives. Brando was silent for a moment. "Are you all okay?" Fortunately, the target of the 2 dragons should be each other. We hid well and did not attract their attention for the time being. "Is it Brando?" Brando could sense the Roman voice in Medisha's senses. The silver elf princess waved her hand at her, motioning her not to make a sound. Medisha's words made Brando feel a little relieved. He thought for a moment and asked, "Do you have any way to enter the secret passage now?" "I'm afraid it will be very difficult," Medisa replied. "That silver dragon is on Rove's compass, but it's already turned into ruins. It's hard to say if we can find the entrance to the secret passage. I can only wait for them to fight before I can confirm it." "Is it dangerous?" "It's fine. Don't worry, my lord, I'll protect myself. If there's any danger, find a way to return to the portal." "I know. Wait for me, I'll be right there." Brando picked up the trembling Cooper. "Come with me, take me to Rove's compass." Sir Cooper was so scared that his legs turned to jelly. He struggled desperately and said, "My lord, you're crazy." "I'm not crazy. Maynard, take Earl Alcorn, Yuta, and Falern with you. Keep an eye on that rat. I have something to ask it." "Mr. Walton, you can tell the nobles in the tomb that the plan has changed. We have to carry out Plan B. They can leave or stay, but I won't send them out of the city. He paused for a moment. This sentence applies to you too. Walton looked at Cooper, who was in Brando's hand, and shook his head helplessly. Do we have a Plan B? The Nightsong Tiger asked in confusion. Now we do. Brando replied. My lord, Medisha helplessly realized that Brando had unilaterally cut off the telepathic connection. She sighed and felt slightly moved. Obsidian, I haven't heard this name for a long time. I used to regret losing it. At this moment, the voice in the sky was still thundering. But Mithril, it's a pity that it's not now. You were so arrogant in Semillion, but now. You're like a stray dog. You shouldn't have appeared. Only death awaits you. Obsidian, it's you who deserve to die. Have you forgotten the sacred agreement? How dare you participate in the war of the mortal world? The three of you are crazy. You've made one mistake after another. Only the harshest punishment awaits you. The silver dragon proudly raised its head and replied coldly. Punishment. Malthus sneered. Who will carry it out? The ancients thought that they could avoid the disaster by living in seclusion. How sad and ridiculous. Me. You. There was a hint of mockery in Malthus's voice. Have you fully recovered, Mithril? Mithril let out a roar and spread her silver wings. The earth trembled slightly as she shot into the sky like an arrow, heading straight for Malthus. The wind pressure produced by the dragon's wings created a terrible storm in half of the town. Everyone in the vicinity was blown away. Rows of houses groaned in the wind. The slightly older buildings were almost uprooted. The loose walls and roofs disintegrated into countless fragments like butterflies in the storm. The two dragons collided in midair. At that moment, the whole sky seemed to be shining with the brilliance of the lines of law. Half of the night sky was densely covered with golden flame patterns, and the other half flashed with layers of overlapping pale silver networks. The two completely different scenes completely enveloped the entire Greystone town and spread in all directions. With the two dragons as the epicenter, there seemed to be a moment of delay before a shockwave swept across the entire town. At that moment, Greystone town seemed to have suffered a terrible earthquake. The buildings on both sides of the street collapsed layer by layer like dominoes. Roman was lifted up by the sudden shockwave with a boom sound, heavily slamming into Chiara, who was behind him. The two of them rolled out together and then lost consciousness. Medisha's law of psionic power automatically took effect at the moment of impact, interweaving a gray net of light. But it was useless. She was also pushed into a collapsed house with a groan. The nobles were even more chaotic. Because they did not have elemental power, they were much less affected by the counterattack. However, they were still thrown from side to side. Many of them were even blown out of the windows and landed heavily on the street outside. At the center of the impact, Rove's compass was even more unlucky. The bread shop, which was already in ruins, was blown into the sky by the airflow. The people buried below were immediately dug out by the cyclone and thrown in all directions. Shienni almost screamed as she pulled the elf's cloak out of the cyclone. Delphian crashed into the wall of a building on the opposite side. Fortunately, it was a wooden wall. The Prime Minister's daughter crashed into it with a crack and was lucky not to become a large meat patty. However, her two guards were not so lucky. One of them was thrown dozens of meters away and landed heavily on the ground. The other's head was cut in half by a tile and became a corpse before it fell to the ground. Solons grabbed onto a pillar at the critical moment to avoid the tragedy of being sent to the sky. The young man called F was slightly less lucky and fell directly from the second floor of a nearby house. Only one of them was the luckiest. The dwarf, Boris Anvil, roared, "Who woke me up in the middle of the night?" Then, with a splash, he fell into a nearby tributary of the Milky Way and bubbled a few times. The clouds in the sky rolled back layer by layer, forming a huge hole in the sky. Endless starlight poured down from the hole. The whole city was covered in snow silver. P.S. Continue to ask for monthly votes. It's almost the end of the month. You know. Chapter 935. The two dragons were fighting in the sky above Greystone Town. The shockwaves from the clash of the laws had destroyed more than half of the town in an instant. Several streets were engulfed in flames, and the fire spread further and further with the help of the wind. More buildings had collapsed, and the streets were filled with cracks like broken waves. It was as if the town had experienced a terrible earthquake. It took Sunil a lot of effort to drag the elf out of the center of the battle. Suddenly, a spear-like object flew towards her. Sunil let out a scream and hurriedly let go of the elf. The spear flew between the two of them, and the elf was thrown to the ground. Sunil let out a cry of pain and finally woke up in a daze. Malthus spat fire in the air. The fireball hit Mithril's wings and exploded into sparks. The silver dragon roared in pain and rolled for nearly 100 meters before regaining her balance. Another fireball brushed past her tail and hit a wooden house near the center of the battle. The scorching air and the shock wave of the explosion blew the elf, who had just gotten up from the ground, a few somersaults. She flew across the ruins of a house and was finally stopped by something stuck in the ground. The elf covered her red forehead with tears in her eyes as she got up from the ground. She opened her mouth slightly and found that the thing that stopped her was a silver spear stuck in the ground. The spear didn't look like an ornament in a noble house. Even after such a violent explosion, it didn't leave a single scratch on it. The spear was shining with a silver light. From top to bottom, the spear was engraved with scenes from heaven to hell. Clouds and light, holy and beautiful, naked angels, ugly demons and original sins, and the flames of hell. On the shaft of the spear was a pair of angel wings made of mithril. The spear was stuck in the ground upside down. The blade was flat and 4 fingers wide, like a sharp sword. The edge of the blade was as clean as new, as if it had just been quenched in a forge. Treasure. The little elf's eyes immediately emitted a dazzling brilliance. For a moment, she even forgot about the danger above her head. She quickly stretched out her hands to pull the spear out of the stone slab. Unfortunately, her small body was not even 2/3 the height of the spear. Even after using all her strength, she could not move it at all. But at this time, a crystal-like icicle shot from the top of her head and hit her wide cloak. The impact of the icicle directly pulled the little elf up from the ground with a scream. Together with her spear, she was directly dragged out and nailed to a nearby wooden stake. Damn thief! The young man next to the Prime Minister's daughter appeared from the second floor of a nearby building, his body covered in injuries. He bared his fangs and brandished his claws at the little elf. You are the thief. The little elf was very angry and immediately retorted, the little elf is Nightingale. Then, she desperately tried to pull out the icicle above her head. That icicle had nailed her cloak to a crooked wooden stake, hanging her in midair. She twisted and turned for a long time, but her short little hands still couldn't reach the icicle. She was so anxious that her little face turned red. Seeing this scene, Ev couldn't help but laugh. Who told you to be stubborn? He raised his right hand, a ball of ice was floating in the middle of his palm, and then he shouted at the little elf, quickly put down the thing in your hand, and I will spare your life. The little elf was a little scared, but she was even more angry. She pulled her lower eyelid with her index finger, stuck out her tongue at him, and made a face, no way. You deserve to die. Ev shouted, flustered and exasperated. He reached out his hand and was about to cast a spell. Xianni, don't wait, quickly catch him. the little elf hurriedly shouted. Ev was startled, and hurriedly looked back, but behind him was a dark room, and there was no sign of Xianni. He immediately realized that he had been fooled, and when he turned his head, he found that there was only an empty cloak left on the wooden stake. The little elf had already drilled out of the cloak and ran far away. The young man immediately felt that his intelligence had been severely damaged. He was so angry that he didn't care that he was a weak elementalist, and directly jumped down from the second floor. He screamed as he fell, and only then did he limp up from the ground. He gritted his teeth and chased after the little elf. At this time, Solons came out from the other side of the ruins. Seeing his companion in such a sorry state, he couldn't help but ask in surprise, "Ev, what happened to you? Did you see the young mistress?" "I don't know where the young mistress is either." Ev gnashed his teeth and shouted, "Quickly catch that damned brat. She stole our demon slayer spear." Solons was shocked. The demon slayer spear was the family heirloom of the Floyds. Count Floyd had only lent it to them because his mistress was the fiancée of Viscount Elman Floyd. If it was stolen, the reputation of the Prime Minister's family would be ruined. He hurriedly unsheathed his two-handed sword and chased after the little elf. When the little elf turned back and saw that there was one more person chasing after her, and one of them was the ferocious-looking fellow who had caught Xianni, she couldn't help but be scared out of her wits. Inwardly, she complained that Xianni hadn't come to save her yet. She ran for her life until she was out of breath. She was gasping for air, her face pale. Suddenly, she heard the sound of wind coming from the darkness. It sounded like the sound of wings flapping. She became alert and shouted happily, "Xianni, you're here to save me. Don't think this trick will work again." When Ev heard the little elf repeat her old trick, he was almost angered to death. She simply looked down on him too much. In any case, he was also a dignified magician, not one of those rude and ignorant barbarian beasts on the border. A fireball had already appeared in his hand, and he was ready to blow the little elf up. Solons grabbed him and said, "Careful, there's something up ahead. Don't listen to her nonsense." Ev was about to go crazy. He pushed Solons away and said, "She," but the latter half of his sentence was drowned out by a sharp whistle. His eyes widened. Suddenly, he saw a pair of huge fleshy wings in the darkness ahead of him, followed by a terrifying face. Under the two pairs of huge horns, there were long and narrow emerald-like eyes shining fiercely. On top of the thick black scales, there were horny bone plates that looked like a swarm of bees. Strong and powerful limbs, sharp claws, and a huge bloody mouth that was filled with golden flames. Dragon. The young man didn't even have time to say a word before he was completely submerged in a sea of fire. Solons watched as his companion's skin peeled off in front of him, revealing burning muscles, bones, and internal organs. Then the blood evaporated and turned into ashes. He was stunned for a moment. The terrifying monster spat out flames and swept across the sky, turning the whole street into a sea of fire. In the dark night, many such dragon beasts were descending from the sky. They spiraled into Greystone Town and spat out fireballs to set the streets ablaze. They whistled as they flew over the fire, creating a hellish scene. "Get out of my way!" Brando roared. The icy blue sword in his hand flashed with a long and narrow light, and a dragon beast that was charging at him was cut in half. He carried Cooper and moved forward without any hindrance. The dragon beast that was cut in half fell to the sides and crashed into the buildings on both sides. Like a cannonball, the buildings made of wood and stone collapsed. Cooper looked at the scene with his mouth agape. He finally had a clear understanding of the Count's strength. That was a ridgetop dragon, a grade 7 creature of Georgandy Ridge. It couldn't even withstand a single blow from Brando. Brando walked on the street filled with blood. The frost-chant Cinna in his hand dripped with the same color. Behind him was a sea of fire, and the golden flames shone brightly on the river of blood. Walton followed behind him with mixed feelings. Count Alcorn and the other nobles of Cruz who were rescued from the tomb were behind him. Except for the Count, who was over 50 years old and still looked calm, most of the others were trembling in fear. From time to time, they would look up at the two dragons fighting in the sky. From time to time, there would be flaming harpies falling from above, leaving long flaming trails behind them. Sometimes, there would be screaming cavemen fleeing in all directions. But no one cared. Everyone thought they were crazy, but no one dared to fall half a step behind. How far is it? You can see it when you turn the corner. Someone among the nobles suddenly screamed. Brando looked up and saw the silver dragon falling from the sky. Medisha pushed away the collapsed wall with a crash. She coughed loudly and shouted in the smoke, "Miss Roman, Your Highness, are you okay?" After a moment, a weak voice replied, "I'm fine, Sister Medisha." Two figures walked out from behind the smoke, one tall and one short. The tall one was Medusa Lysimachia. She had a bloody wound on her arm, while the little prince was unharmed. "Where's the Roman? I didn't see her." "Where's Miss Chiara?" "Princess Magadol." "I'm fine." The nun princess replied softly. Cries could be heard in the darkness. Some were dead, some were injured. Everyone stood up weakly and tried to find the nearest person. Medisha quickly found Eke, Sergeant Marjorie, Duke's daughter Eugenie, Dilferi and her knight Nia, Enid and Judith, and finally Nasha. The others also gathered together one after another. Other than Marjorie, who was slightly injured, the knight of the inner court was the most seriously injured. A sharp shard pierced her lung. When she was found, she was already unconscious and had a fever. She was mumbling something in a daze. The nobles of Cruz suffered heavy losses. 7 or 8 of them died. Some of them were missing an arm or a leg. If they did not receive timely treatment, they would not live for more than a few days. Most of the others were also injured. Most of them were depressed, and many even fell into despair. After counting the number of people, Medisha found that Roman and Chiara could not be found. The latter was fine, but the former was the fiancé of the Lord and one of her few human friends. She panicked and ordered everyone to spread out to find the whereabouts of the merchant lady and the king's eldest son's sister. But in the end, they got a clue from the sobbing daughter of the Grenoir's family. Before the explosion, Sister Roman and Sister Chiara were in front of me. The little girl replied softly, sobbing. Following that, the others began to recall the scene one after another. Bloomfield, the deputy commander of the Solstice Knights, found the place where Roman and Chiara were last seen according to everyone's description. They dug up the rubble and found a dark hole below. "This is a secret passage." Bloomfield was stunned for a moment before he reacted. "Are Sister Roman and the others down there?" The little prince asked worriedly. "It's sealed down there." Medusa's prismatic vertical pupils shone in the darkness. She only glanced at the secret passage and replied indifferently. Medisha did not speak. She was an undead, and darkness was no obstacle for her. What Lysimachia could see was naturally not difficult for her. "Find a way to dig it out," she replied. A hand pressed down on her hand in the darkness. Medisha was slightly startled. She turned around and saw the Duke's daughter looking at her with bright eyes. "Miss Medisha, we can't do that. The nobles of Cruz are very emotional and can cause trouble at any time. The injured also need to be treated. This is the center of the battlefield. There are 2 dragons. We can't stay here for long. I don't know what the commander told you, but we have to move now." Medisha's eyes showed hesitation, and she gently bit her lower lip. The battle outside didn't stop for even a moment. The fire continued to spread, and from time to time, golden rays of light would seep in from the cracks of the ruins. The dry wood crackled in the flames, and the temperature was rising every moment. The dragon flew over the streets, causing the already shaky buildings to creak as if they would collapse at any moment. In such an environment, everyone's nerves were stretched tight. Injury and despair could make people collapse at any time and do unreasonable things. Brando had also ordered her to return to the portal, but the problem was, what about Miss Roman? Eugenie said again, let Mr. Eckert and Her Royal Highness take the others and move. I will stay with you to find Miss Roman. Medisha looked at her in surprise. Miss Eugenie, Miss Medisha, you are that person's subordinate, and I am a member of the diplomatic team. I will stay and represent Erewhon's diplomatic team. This is my duty. The Duke's daughter calmly replied, don't worry, I will never accept the reputation of the diplomatic team abandoning their members to escape alone. I'll stay too. Petty Officer Marjorie suddenly replied. The Duke's daughter turned around and glared at him in annoyance. Miss Medisha, I alone will be enough. Medisha looked at the two, especially Marjorie's wound, and couldn't help but smile. If that's the case, I'm afraid Mr. Marjorie won't agree. Then let's do as Miss Eugenie says. Leave the outside matters to Mr. Eckert and Commander Bloomfield. We will stay and look for Miss Roman and Miss Chiara. In the darkness, Eugenie and Marjorie's faces blushed when they saw the Silver Elf Princess's teasing gaze. The little elf opened her mouth wide and looked up at the group of dragons flying over her head. After the dragons flew past and turned Effie into ashes, they circled around in the air and then slowly landed in front of her. They flapped their wings twice and landed heavily on the ground. They stared at this little dot with ominous glints in their eyes. The little elf covered the dust with her hands and coughed. She looked at the big guy through the gaps between her fingers. After a while, she asked in surprise, how did you become so big? The dragon beast shook its huge head and slowly approached her. It seemed to have noticed that the other party was not afraid at all. Suddenly, it felt that its dignity had been challenged. It spread its wings and let out a deafening roar at the little thing. The little elf screamed and covered her ears, as if she was shivering in a storm. She closed her eyes and angrily shouted, how dare you shout at me, Judy? I will never talk to you again. You are so bad. This time, it was the dragon beast's turn to be puzzled. The dragon beast was a race of inferior dragons, but it was slightly more intelligent than the viper dragons. Even with its huge brain, it couldn't understand why this little thing dared to yell at it. If it could, it almost wanted to scratch its head, wondering how this little thing could pose a threat to it, and why it dared to stand in front of it so fearlessly. But the dragon was not a race with true intelligence, so it couldn't understand the cause and effect of this. It couldn't figure it out for a while, so it decided to follow its primitive instinct and spit out a flame towards the little elf. In its simpler logic, if it burned to death, then it was an enemy it could provoke, and if it couldn't burn to death, then it had to consider making way. A wisp of flame from the ridged dragon beast was just a fireball the size of a small house for the little elf, but when she saw the golden flame pressing towards her, she was stunned. Judy wanted to kill her. Little elf. You're a complete idiot. How is that ugly, stupid, and dull fellow like me? With a shriek, a black shadow flew out of nowhere and headbutted the little elf. Then, the two of them rolled into a ball and rolled out of the range of the fireball. With a loud bang, the fireball hit the ground and exploded. Scorching hot air swept across the street, and the two guys rolling together were sent flying several meters away by the shockwave. Only then did they come to a stop amidst a series of screams. The little elf tearfully hugged the thing that hit her and said happily, Judy, I knew you wouldn't kill me. You are so good. Get out of here, you naughty brat. Judy angrily swept her tail across the little elf's face. P.S. Friends who have been following Amber for a long time, there are only 2 days left until I achieve my record of 3 months of continuous updates. Your encouragement is my motivation for writing, the more votes the better. You're tuning in to the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.